You've been holding on for too long, to pain, to control, to who you think you're supposed to be. You carry the weight of old memories, broken dreams, regrets that replay in your head like a song you can't turn off. You try to move on, but something always pulls you back, an invisible tension in your chest, a voice in your mind that just won't let go, and the world tells you, just be happy. Let it go. But no one ever tells you how. Tonight, you're going to learn how. Not with more advice, not with more pressure to fix yourself, but with the quiet, powerful wisdom of Buddhism, passed down for thousands of years. Teachings that don't ask you to become someone else, but to drop everything you're not. You'll learn what it means to truly let go, not pretend, not suppress, but release. Release the story, the fear, the need to control what happens next. Because once you stop clinging, you'll finally feel peace. This isn't about chasing some perfect version of yourself. It's about realizing there was never anything wrong with you in the first place. It's about remembering who you were before the world told you who to be. It's about becoming empty, not lost, but free. As you listen tonight, something will shift. The noise will fade. The tension will soften. You'll feel yourself melting into a silence that holds you like a warm blanket. And when you wake up tomorrow, the world won't feel so heavy. You won't feel so stuck. You'll breathe deeper, move lighter, smile without forcing it. This isn't just another audio to fall asleep to. This is a soft undoing of everything that's kept you from peace. A quiet revolution inside your heart. Are you ready to let go? Let's begin. You've been holding on for too long. To pain, to control, to who you think you're supposed to be. You carry the weight of old memories, broken dreams, regrets that replay in your head like a song you can't turn off. You try to move on, but something always pulls you back, an invisible tension in your chest, a voice in your mind that just won't let go, and the world tells you, just be happy. Let it go. But no one ever tells you how. Tonight, you're going to learn how. Not with more advice, not with more pressure to fix yourself, but with the quiet, powerful wisdom of Buddhism, passed down for thousands of years. Teachings that don't ask you to become someone else, but to drop everything you're not. You'll learn what it means to truly let go, not pretend, not suppress, but release. Release the story, the fear, the need to control what happens next. Because once you stop clinging, you'll finally feel peace. This isn't about chasing some perfect version of yourself. It's about realizing there was never anything wrong with you in the first place. It's about remembering who you were before the world told you who to be. It's about becoming empty, not lost, but free. As you listen tonight, something will shift. The noise will fade. The tension will soften. You'll feel yourself melting into a silence that holds you like a warm blanket. And when you wake up tomorrow, the world won't feel so heavy. You won't feel so stuck. You'll breathe deeper, move lighter, smile without forcing it. This isn't just another audio to fall asleep to. This is a soft undoing of everything that's kept you from peace. A quiet revolution inside your heart. Are you ready to let go? Let's begin. The self. That word feels so familiar, right? You say, I feel sad. I'm not good enough. That hurt me. But who is the I in that sentence? Who are you really? It sounds like a simple question, but for 2,500 years, Buddhist teachers have given a radically different answer than anything you've heard. They say there is no permanent, solid you, no unchanging self behind your thoughts and feelings, no little person living inside your head watching your life unfold. What you think of as you is just a collection of habits, memories, thoughts, emotions, and sensations constantly arising and passing. That's the teaching of anatta, non-self. And it's not meant to confuse you. It's meant to set you free. Because here's the truth. Most of your suffering comes from trying to protect something that doesn't actually exist. That false, made-up self. You try to defend your reputation. You cling to your opinions. You carry around the stories of your past like armor. But underneath all that, just awareness. Just the quiet space in which everything appears and disappears. You've never had a single thought that stayed forever. Not one. Every mood you've ever had has faded eventually. Every identity you've taken on, student, friend, partner, failure, success, they've all changed. If any of them were truly you, they'd never leave. But they do. So who's left? The answer isn't something to figure out with your mind. It's something you see through practice, through stillness, through paying attention. Start small. Watch your thoughts without getting involved. One thought says, I can't do this. Another says, I'm fine. Another says, this is boring. And they all pass, one by one, like clouds in the sky, like characters in a play. The more you watch, the more you notice. None of them actually stick. And none of them are you. You aren't your thoughts. That may sound obvious, but sit with it. You are not the thing that's saying, I'm not enough. You're the one hearing that voice. You're the space it moves through. When you really see this, not just intellectually, but deep in your bones, it changes everything. Suddenly, thoughts lose their grip. They stop feeling like facts and start feeling like echoes. And in that space, you feel something strange. Stillness, peace, freedom. But it goes even further. You're not your emotions either. You've said things like, I am angry, or I am anxious. But anger and anxiety aren't who you are. They're visitors, temporary guests. Have you noticed how they show up, peak, and then fade, just like waves? The mistake we make is grabbing them, holding on, identifying with them, saying, this is me. But it's not. It never was. Buddhism teaches that clinging to these experiences, this false sense of self, is the root of suffering. You suffer not because emotions come, but because you think they mean something about you. That if you're sad, you must be broken. If you're afraid, you must be weak. But sadness is just sadness. Fear is just fear. They're natural. They come and go. And you remain, like the sky, untouched by the weather. And once you really let go of the need to be someone all the time, something beautiful happens. You stop needing control. You stop trying to force life to fit your idea of who you are. You start flowing with it. You accept what's happening, not because you're giving up, but because you're no longer trying to bend the world around a made-up identity. Think about how often your mind says things like, I don't deserve this, or they shouldn't treat me like that. Those are statements based on a fixed idea of self. But what if there was no fixed me to defend? What if you could let that identity dissolve and just meet life as it is, moment by moment? This is where detachment comes in, not the cold, emotionless kind, but the peaceful, spacious kind. Detachment means you're no longer trapped in the drama of your mind. It doesn't mean you don't feel. It means you feel without losing yourself. You don't cling. You don't resist. You just notice. Let it arise. Let it pass. You may have been told that you have to find yourself. But Buddhism flips that completely. It invites you to lose yourself, not in a dangerous way, but in a liberating one. Because what you lose isn't real. It's just a shell, a costume, a pattern. When you let that go, you don't disappear. You wake up. This waking up isn't dramatic, it's subtle. Sometimes it comes in quiet moments, watching the wind move through trees, or hearing a child laugh, or sitting still and breathing. In those moments, there's no story, no identity, just presence. And that presence, that's closer to who you are than any thought ever was. Even language gets in the way sometimes. We're always saying, my thoughts, my emotions, my pain. But who is the my? Buddhism teaches that this idea of ownership is part of the illusion. Nothing is truly yours because nothing lasts. Even your body, something you've called me your whole life, is changing constantly. Cells dying, growing, reshaping. The body you had 10 years ago is not the same body you have now. So if even that isn't solid, where is the self? This teaching of anatta isn't meant to scare you. It's meant to release you. It means you're not stuck. You're not trapped in a fixed role. You don't have to carry your past like a weight. You're not broken because there's no permanent you that could be broken in the first place. There's just experience, fluid, shifting, beautiful. And it also means you don't have to be perfect. You don't need to always say the right thing, feel the right emotion, think the right thought. Because those things aren't who you are. They're just passing weather. What matters is the space underneath, the awareness, the stillness that holds it all. That stillness is what the Buddha pointed to again and again, not as a concept, but as a reality you can taste right now, right here, as you listen, as the breath rises and falls, as your thoughts come and go. There's something in you that doesn't move, that watches without effort, that's not afraid, not grasping, just present. And the more you rest in that, the more you let go. Let go of needing to win. Let go of needing to be special. Let go of needing to be right. Those are all just games the ego plays. But the ego is like a shadow. It only seems real when you believe in it. The moment you turn the light of awareness on it, it starts to disappear. But here's something important. Letting go of self isn't about ignoring your life. It's not about becoming passive or indifferent. It's about meeting life more directly, without filters, without stories. When someone speaks to you, you hear them, not through the lens of, how does this affect me, but through the clarity of presence. When you feel pain, you feel it fully, but without the added layer of identity that says, this pain defines me. That's the freedom Buddhism offers. The freedom not to be locked in the cage of personality. The freedom to respond instead of react. The freedom to be here, not as a somebody, but as awareness itself. And here's the secret. The less you cling to being someone, the more love flows through you. Real love. Not the kind that says, I love you because you make me feel good, but the kind that simply is, because you're not loving from a place of need anymore. You're loving from spaciousness, from clarity, from the truth that there's no separate self to defend or prove. That's what happens when you let go of self. You don't become less human. You become more alive, more open, more at peace. Not because everything is perfect, but because you're no longer trying to control it all through a fragile sense of identity. And that's the deepest letting go of all, not letting go of objects or people or even thoughts, but letting go of the very idea of me. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that leaves you lost, but in a way that brings you home. Home to presence, home to awareness, home to the quiet, simple truth that you were never separate in the first place. So breathe. Let everything soften. Let everything fall. There's nothing to fix, nothing to hold, nothing to become. Just this, just now. You're free. And now that you've seen what it feels like to loosen your grip on the idea of a fixed self, you might begin to notice something else. something subtle but incredibly persistent. Even after you've dropped the story of who you are, even when you stop trying to be someone, there's still a strong pull inside. A tension, a drive to win small battles, to correct, to defend your view, to be right. And that pull, however small it seems, is another form of clinging, a softer mask of the same ego you just began to release. It's easy to miss because it hides behind what feels like certainty. You feel sure of what happened. You feel clear about how things should go. You feel justified in your opinions. But what happens when someone challenges that? What happens when you're faced with disagreement or opposition or silence that doesn't echo back your beliefs? You feel tight, frustrated, misunderstood, maybe even angry. That reaction isn't coming from truth. It's coming from the craving to be right. And that craving is one of the most stubborn forms of suffering. It doesn't look like fear. It doesn't look like control. But it is. Buddhism teaches that the need to be right is one of the most overlooked forms of attachment. It's not always loud. Sometimes it's hidden in quiet assumptions. Sometimes it shows up as needing the last word, or silently judging people who think differently, or replaying a conversation in your head over and over, imagining what you should have said. You don't always speak it out loud, but the mind still clings, still fights invisible battles, still holds on to being right as if your identity depends on it. And that's the key. It's not about the facts. It's about the identity underneath them. When you're deeply attached to your views, it's often because you've built part of your worth around them. You start to think your opinions are you, your beliefs are you. And when someone disagrees, it doesn't just feel like a difference, it feels like a threat. That's why arguments can become so emotional, even over small things. That's why you can feel so much tension even after you walk away. Because underneath the surface, your mind is still trying to hold on, still trying to prove itself, still trying to be someone. Buddhism offers a different path, a quieter one. It teaches that peace doesn't come from being right. It comes from letting go of the whole need to be right in the first place. That's where humility begins, not the forced kind, not the performative kind, but the real kind. The kind that comes from no longer needing to protect your ego. When you truly let go of the craving to be right, you don't become weak. You become open, clear, free. Your energy is no longer spent defending your image or proving your intelligence. It's returned to awareness, to stillness, to understanding what really matters in each moment. And this doesn't mean you stop caring about truth. It doesn't mean you accept lies or allow harm, but it changes your relationship with truth. Instead of using truth as a weapon to win, you hold it with gentleness. Instead of needing to prove you're right, you become more interested in what's real, even if that means discovering you were wrong. That's the kind of strength the Buddha pointed to, a strength that doesn't dominate. It dissolves pride. It listens more than it speaks. It seeks clarity, not victory. Right speech is one of the core ethical teachings in Buddhism, and it's deeply connected to this. Speaking in ways that are truthful, but also kind, helpful, and timely. That doesn't mean sugarcoating reality. It means choosing your words not just based on correctness, but on impact. Sometimes being right in content can still be harmful in delivery. Sometimes you can be technically correct, but deeply disconnected from compassion. Right speech asks something harder than just being honest. It asks you to speak from wisdom, not ego. This is where humility starts to take shape. It's not about lowering yourself. It's about seeing clearly that there's nothing above or below, that the hierarchy you're trying to climb with your opinions is just more illusion. Humility means you stop playing the game entirely. You stop competing to be the smartest, the most aware, the most woke, the most enlightened. And when you stop trying to win, you find peace, because there's nothing left to defend. When the Buddha spoke of wise view, he wasn't just talking about holding correct philosophical beliefs. He was pointing to a way of seeing the world that softens the boundaries between self and other. A way of seeing that's more flexible, more spacious. You see your views as perspectives, not as personal territory. You understand that all views arise based on causes and conditions, your upbringing, your culture, your past experiences. And once you see that, you stop clinging so tightly. You stop assuming your view is the only one that's valid. You make space for others, not just in theory, but in your heart. This creates connection, real connection. Because when you no longer need to be right, you become safe to talk to. You become the kind of person people feel at ease around, not because you're passive or silent, but because you're not rigid. You can disagree without turning it into a battle. You can listen without planning your counterattack. You can stay curious instead of defensive. And that curiosity leads to wisdom. Think of how many conflicts, personal, social, political, are fueled by the refusal to admit uncertainty, the refusal to question our assumptions, the need to appear confident, certain, untouchable. But in Buddhism, confidence comes from the opposite place, from not knowing, from admitting your view is limited, from standing in the openness of not having all the answers. That's not weakness, that's maturity, that's freedom. Letting go of being right also changes how you see other people. You stop needing them to validate your opinions. You stop needing them to agree. You begin to appreciate their humanity, even when they see things differently. You listen not to convert, but to understand. You engage not to win, but to connect. And sometimes, when you really listen, something inside you shifts. Not because someone forced you to change your mind, but because you opened your mind willingly. That kind of openness is rare and powerful. It's the ground where transformation grows. But this isn't just about how you interact with others. It's also about your inner dialogue. How often do you argue with yourself? Regret something you said? Try to justify an action in your mind? The need to be right doesn't stop when the conversation ends. It continues inside as mental noise, as rehearsed explanations, as imagined comebacks. All of that drains energy. All of that creates stress. When you let go of needing to be right, even to yourself, you create silence, space. You stop replaying the scene. You stop trying to make yourself look good in your own head. And that's when real peace begins. This practice takes courage. Letting go of being right feels vulnerable at first. It feels like losing control, like losing your footing. But what you're actually losing is the illusion of control, the illusion of certainty, the illusion of superiority. And what you're gaining is something much more solid, a deep, grounded presence that doesn't depend on being correct, a calm that isn't shaken by disagreement, a sense of self-worth that isn't built on being smarter or sharper or more informed. You begin to speak less, but when you do speak, it's with more care, more clarity, more love. You stop using conversation to impress. You stop using knowledge as a shield. You start asking better questions. You become more interested in learning than in winning. And slowly, you realize that the more you let go of needing to be right, the more right you actually feel. Not because you've proven anything, but because you're no longer trying to. This is where inner liberation begins. Not in some dramatic moment, but in the small, silent shifts. the moment you pause before correcting someone, the moment you breathe instead of defend, the moment you listen to understand, even when your ego is screaming to speak. These moments build strength, not the kind that dominates, but the kind that endures. And something else happens. As you drop the need to be right, you stop taking things so personally. You stop seeing disagreement as attack. You stop seeing correction as insult. You stop tying your worth to being agreed with. And when that happens, life becomes lighter. You stop walking through the world with armor. You start moving with openness. Humility becomes not just a concept, but a way of being, a way of relating, a quiet strength that needs nothing extra to prove itself. So the next time you feel the urge to argue, to prove, to correct, pause. Feel what's underneath that urge. Is it love, or is it fear? Is it truth, or is it ego trying to hold on? That moment of pause is the doorway. You don't have to step through right away. Just notice it. The more you notice, the more space you create. And in that space, something beautiful appears. Not victory, not dominance, but peace, presence, connection. And that's the point. Not to be right, but to be real, to be free, to be whole without needing to be above anyone else. The ego will always look for a pedestal, but the heart is looking for peace. The heart doesn't need to be right. It just wants to be here, to be open, to be free. And now, that's where we go next. And once the grip of needing to be right begins to loosen, what you're left with is even deeper. The craving to be right often hides inside something more slippery, more deeply rooted. Not just being right about an argument, but being right about who you are, the roles you play, the identity you carry, the storyline you've built your life around. That's what we cling to when nothing else feels stable. That's the foundation we keep returning to, even when we know it causes pain. But Buddhism offers a mirror, one that shows how even this identity we defend so fiercely isn't solid, isn't permanent, isn't even real in the way we think it is. And letting it go doesn't mean losing yourself. It means finally being free from the box you didn't know you were trapped in. We're trained to believe identity equals safety. That if we can just figure out who we are, our personality, our strengths, our roles, then life will feel stable. But identity, in the Buddhist view, is a mental habit. It's something the mind does to create a sense of control. It grabs experiences, preferences, and roles, and builds a narrative. Then it says, "This is me. I am this kind of person. I am not that. I believe this. I've always been like this." But if you pay attention closely, you'll see that none of those statements are completely true. They're simplifications, summaries, filters, and the more you repeat them, the more trapped you feel. Every identity, even the positive ones, comes with tension. Because once you name yourself as something, smart, strong, helpful, spiritual, you feel pressure to live up to that label. You begin to edit yourself to maintain the image. You get scared of anything that contradicts it. You avoid feedback that challenges it. You might even cut off parts of yourself that don't match the role. And that fragmentation over time creates suffering. Because deep down, you know you're more than the image. You know you're changing all the time. But identity says, no, stay here. This is who you are. So you stay. And it becomes a prison. The danger of identity is that it doesn't just define how you see yourself, it filters how you see others. If you see yourself as a victim, everyone starts to look like a threat. If you see yourself as superior, everyone starts to look small. If you see yourself as broken, even love feels suspicious. And so identity shapes not just how you live, but how you suffer. Because every label you cling to comes with fear, the fear of losing it. What if I'm not that anymore? What if people stop seeing me this way? What if I fail to live up to the story? Buddhism offers a different approach. It says you don't need a fixed identity to live. You don't need to know who you are in words. In fact, the less tightly you cling to a narrative, the more freely you can move through life, because you're not performing anymore. You're just being. And that's where emptiness becomes powerful, not as a cold void, but as freedom from all the roles you've been taught to play. When Buddhism speaks of emptiness, it's not saying you don't exist. It's saying nothing exists independently, permanently, or unchangingly, including you, including the person you think you are. Take a closer look at your identity. Where did it come from? Did you choose it, or was it shaped by your parents, your culture, your fears, your traumas? Maybe you learned to be the responsible one, the quiet one, the tough one. Maybe you were told you were talented, or lazy, or too sensitive, or the black sheep. Over time, those messages start to stick. They become labels. Then they become beliefs. Then they become personality. And before you know it, you're not responding to life anymore. You're acting out a script. The problem with the script is that it's rigid. It tells you what you're allowed to feel, what you're allowed to want, who you're allowed to be. And the mind, in its fear of the unknown, keeps choosing the familiar role, even if it hurts, even if it's outdated, even if it no longer fits who you've become. Because the ego would rather suffer in the known than risk dissolving in the unknown. But Buddhism says the unknown is not your enemy. It's your doorway. That's where impermanence comes in. Nothing you've ever called me has lasted. Not your thoughts, not your emotions, not your habits. Even your memories shift over time. So what makes you think your identity is stable? It's not. It's a process, a flow, a temporary pattern. And if you stop grabbing onto it, you'll start to feel that flow. You'll start to see how different parts of you come online depending on the situation, how flexible you actually are, and how much energy you've been spending trying to be consistent when in reality you were never meant to be fixed. Letting go of identity doesn't mean becoming nobody. It means becoming open. It means dropping the filters that keep you locked in the past. It means meeting this moment fresh, without dragging your storyline into it. You're not bound to your past decisions. You're not trapped in your roles. You don't have to keep playing the part just because you played it yesterday. You're allowed to change. You're allowed to grow. You're allowed to not know who you are. There's freedom in not knowing. There's peace in being undefinable. It means you can let your actions speak instead of your labels. It means you can be honest instead of consistent. It means you can evolve without guilt. That's what Buddhism means when it says the self is empty. It's not erasing you. It's freeing you. This freedom also changes how you relate to pain. When you believe in a fixed self, pain becomes personal. You say, "This always happens to me," or "Why am I like this?" But if you release that story, pain becomes just pain. It's no longer proof of your brokenness. It's no longer a reflection of your identity. It's just a wave moving through. And when you meet it without the extra layer of self-definition, it passes more easily. There's no resistance, no judgment, just space. That space is where healing happens, because you're not reinforcing the old patterns anymore. You're not reacting from the same identity that created the wound. You're responding from presence, from awareness, from that quiet place that doesn't need a label to be alive. Letting go of identity also invites more compassion. When you stop seeing yourself as a fixed person, you stop seeing others that way too. You stop locking people into roles. You stop reducing them to their mistakes or their labels. You start seeing them as fluid, changing, like you. That's what real compassion is. Not pity, not superiority, but recognition. We're all just waves in the ocean, all moving, all shifting, all empty of a fixed center. And in that, we're connected. This insight doesn't happen all at once. It's a practice, a softening, a gradual loosening of the grip. Every time you notice yourself saying, "I'm just this way," pause. Ask yourself, is that true now? Or is it just a habit? Every time you feel the pressure to perform your role, breathe. Ask yourself, who am I if I don't hold that image? These questions aren't meant to lead you to a new identity. They're meant to lead you beyond identity, to that still, quiet awareness that watches without clinging. And the more you rest there, the more effortless life becomes. You no longer need to explain yourself all the time. You no longer need people to see you a certain way. You stop editing yourself for approval. You stop fighting to be understood. You're not proving anything anymore. You're just being, and that being is enough. Even spiritual identity can become a trap. You start identifying as the mindful one, the awakened one, the peaceful one. And suddenly, you're performing again. You're editing your experience to match the role. But peace doesn't come from being the peaceful person. It comes from dropping the need to be any person at all. Buddhism keeps pointing back to this. The person you think you are is not the one who wakes up. The one who wakes up is beyond thought, beyond form, beyond name. And the moment you touch that space, even for a second, everything shifts. The craving to be somebody starts to dissolve, and in its place, you feel something else. Spaciousness, lightness, truth. And that truth can't be put into words. It can't be labeled or owned, but it can be lived. It can be felt. It can be trusted. You don't have to keep looking for yourself anymore. You don't have to keep building and maintaining a story. You don't have to hold yourself together. You can just let go. Let go of who you think you are. Let go of who you've been told to be. Let go of the roles, the labels, the narratives. You don't need them to exist. You don't need them to matter. You don't need them to love and be loved. All of that comes not from identity, but from presence. And presence is always here, beneath the story, beneath the name, beneath the roles and masks and images. It's always been here, waiting for you to stop performing, waiting for you to just return. So now the story softens, the performance pauses, the mask falls, and what's left isn't empty in the painful sense. It's empty in the freeing sense. Nothing to prove, nothing to hold, nothing to fear. Only this, only now, only freedom. Once the roles fade and the stories fall silent, what remains is something rare: space. But the moment that space opens, something else often creeps in. A kind of restless itch, an urge to fill the quiet with comfort, with something pleasant, something easy. After all, you've been told that ease equals happiness, that comfort is peace. But that story, too, is worth questioning. Because what if the constant search for comfort is exactly what's keeping you unsettled? What if the real path to peace isn't in escaping discomfort, but choosing it on purpose? Buddhism doesn't celebrate pain for the sake of suffering. It doesn't glorify struggle. But it does point to a deeper truth. Not all discomfort is harmful. Some of it is medicine. Some of it is cleansing. And when it's chosen mindfully, when it's embraced as a tool rather than endured as a punishment, it becomes a doorway to real strength. In the modern world, we're surrounded by things designed to make life easier. Everything's optimized, delivered, on demand. And on the surface, it seems like we should be happier than ever. But the truth is, we're more anxious, more restless, and more dependent than ever before. Because the more we avoid discomfort, the more power it has over us. Every time we run from it, it grows in the background. And slowly, we become fragile. We become ruled by our cravings. We lose our resilience. That's why Buddhist practice includes renunciation, not as rejection, not as punishment, but as intentional discomfort, as the discipline of letting go, not because you have to, but because you choose to. You say no to excess, not because you don't deserve pleasure, but because you want to see what's underneath your dependency on it. You give something up, not to be ascetic, but to be free. True renunciation isn't about living in a cave. It's about stepping back from habits that keep you asleep. It's about confronting your attachments one by one and asking, do I really need this? Or is it a distraction? Is it helping me wake up? Or is it another way of avoiding what I don't want to feel? Voluntary discomfort is powerful because it flips the script. Instead of being a victim of circumstances, you become a participant in your own liberation. You choose to skip the luxury, the extra bite, the endless scrolling. You fast, not to suffer, but to taste what hunger feels like without fear. You sit still, even when the body aches, because you want to learn the art of staying. You don't give in to every desire, because you want to see where desire comes from, what it's made of, and whether it's really as urgent as it claims to be. Each act of restraint builds inner strength. Each pause between impulse and reaction builds clarity. You start to see how so much of your life has been driven by the craving to be comfortable. And you start to ask a different question, not what will make me feel good right now, but what will bring real peace in the long run. That's the power of renunciation. It reclaims your attention. It sharpens your mind. It shows you that you are not your urges. You are not your appetites. You can want something and not act on it. You can feel discomfort and not collapse. You can sit in the fire and find stillness there. This doesn't mean rejecting all pleasure. It means no longer being owned by it. It means being able to enjoy things without needing them. It means knowing you can let go at any time and still be whole. That's real freedom. Not the freedom to indulge every craving, but the freedom from being enslaved by them. Buddhist monks and nuns take vows not because they hate life, but because they want to live it more fully. They simplify, strip away, and pare down, not to punish themselves, but to cut through the noise. And while you may not live in a monastery, the spirit of renunciation can live inside your daily life. You don't have to give up everything. You just have to give up the things that keep you asleep. The endless entertainment, the constant stimulation, the little luxuries that turn into dependencies, the habits that seem harmless but add up to a kind of inner dullness. The real practice is in noticing them, noticing where you reach for comfort without thinking, where you escape your feelings instead of facing them, and then, with gentleness, choosing to stop, just for a moment, just to see what's there. Voluntary discomfort teaches you how to be okay with what's uncomfortable, not to like it, but to stay with it, to breathe through it, and eventually to realize that so much of what you thought was unbearable isn't. The hunger passes, the boredom dissolves, the craving loses its grip, and in its place you find something deeper than comfort. You find peace. Because peace isn't always soft. Sometimes it's forged in heat. Sometimes it's born in the space where you want to escape, but choose to stay. That's when something shifts. That's when you realize you don't need more to feel whole. You need less. Not because less is morally superior, but because less reveals what's always been there, the simplicity, the quiet, the stillness that was hidden under all the noise. When you practice renunciation, you're practicing freedom. You're saying to your mind, I'm not afraid to feel what I feel. I don't need to numb this. I don't need to run. You're training your nervous system to relax in discomfort. You're training your mind to stop chasing. You're training your heart to open, not just when things feel good, but when they feel real. This strength doesn't show up in your muscles. It shows up in your responses, in the way you handle stress, in your ability to say no without guilt, in your capacity to be still without reaching for something to fix the moment. This kind of strength builds slowly, but it lasts. You also start to see how much suffering comes from the constant need for things to be just right. The perfect temperature, the perfect timing, the perfect plan. When you step into voluntary discomfort, you loosen your grip on those expectations. You allow things to be imperfect. You become more adaptable, less reactive, and that makes life easier, not because it's more comfortable, but because you're no longer demanding comfort all the time. Even small practices can have a big effect. Turning off the phone for an hour, walking instead of driving, eating a simpler meal, sleeping without distractions, listening to silence instead of music. These aren't punishments, they're invitations, opportunities to come back to what's real, to sit with yourself without needing anything extra, to feel the edge of discomfort and realize it won't break you. This approach changes your relationship with pleasure too. You begin to appreciate it more, not as an escape, but as a gift, something to be enjoyed with presence, not clung to. You're not rushing to the next high. You're not chasing the next thrill. You're just here, fully alive, whether the moment is soft or sharp. Voluntary discomfort also deepens gratitude, because when you've chosen to go without, you no longer take small things for granted. A warm meal, a kind word, a quiet moment. These become treasures, not entitlements. You stop needing more. You start seeing what's already enough. And you stop fearing loss, because you've already practiced letting go. You've already tasted the freedom of simplicity. You've already learned that joy doesn't come from clinging. It comes from presence, from clarity, from having nothing to protect. This is where the teachings of the Buddha become practical. He didn't teach renunciation to create more suffering. He taught it to reveal how much of your suffering is optional, how much of it comes from clinging to what feels good and resisting what doesn't. When you let go of that pattern, even for a moment, you touch something beyond pain and pleasure. You touch peace. That peace is not loud. It's not dramatic. It's quiet. It's humble. But it's steady. And once you feel it, even for a second, you start to crave something different. Not more comfort, but more truth. Not more stimulation, but more clarity. Not more of everything, just more of what matters. So this isn't about deprivation. It's not about proving your worth through suffering. It's about reclaiming your power. The power to choose discomfort when it leads to freedom. The power to say no when everything around you says yes. The power to be still when everything inside you wants to run. Because that's where peace is hiding. Not in the perfect moment, but in the moment you stop needing it to be perfect. Not in the things you add, but in the things you release. Not in what feels good, but in what's real. This is the strength of renunciation. Not in how much you give up, but in how fully you return. To presence, to clarity, to the quiet truth that you don't need more to be okay. You just need to stop running. And now, with this strength beginning to settle in your bones, we go deeper, not to escape discomfort, but to understand it, not to reject life, but to meet it without filters. The next step begins in the space where clinging ends, and in that space, a new kind of stillness starts to rise. After sitting in the quiet fire of voluntary discomfort, something becomes clear. The things you thought you needed start to lose their grip. Pleasure loses its urgency. Possessions begin to feel lighter. Even identity starts to dissolve. But there's one attachment that often hides deeper than all the rest. Something praised, admired, even honored in every culture. It's not about what you own. It's not about how you feel. It's about what you leave behind. Your legacy, the mark you make, the idea that when you're gone, your name, your work, your story will still echo through time. But Buddhism invites you to look at this too, not to shame it, but to see it clearly. Because the need to be remembered is still a need, and any need rooted in the ego keeps you from the present moment. We don't often question this craving. From an early age, we're told to make something of ourselves, leave a footprint, build a name. And whether it's through your work, your art, your family, your beliefs, or even your suffering, the message is the same. If you leave a mark, your life will matter. But what if that belief is just another form of clinging? What if the pressure to create a legacy is actually pulling you away from the one place you're meant to live, right here, right now? In Buddhist practice, there's a teaching often referred to as die before you die. It's not morbid. It's liberating. It means to let the ego die before the body does, to drop the craving for permanence, to release the need to be significant in the eyes of others or in the pages of history. This is not about giving up meaning. It's about seeing that true meaning doesn't come from being remembered. It comes from how fully you show up in this very breath. The mind resists this. It says, "But if I let go of legacy, won't my life disappear?" That's the fear speaking, the voice that believes your value comes from impact, from reputation, from being known. But the Buddha pointed to a different kind of value, one that has nothing to do with being remembered and everything to do with being awake. He taught that the real measure of a life is not how many people remember your name, but how deeply you lived with awareness, with compassion, with presence. And that kind of life needs no monument. It needs no echo. It speaks through the silence it leaves behind. Letting go of legacy doesn't mean your actions don't matter. It means you stop using the future as your source of validation. You stop living for someday recognition. You stop trying to script how people will speak about you when you're gone. You drop the invisible pressure to build a story that lasts, and in that dropping, you find peace. Because you're no longer working for ghosts. You're no longer performing for an audience that hasn't even been born yet. You're simply here. There's something profoundly honest about that, because the truth is, no matter how big your legacy is, it fades. Names get forgotten, stories change, monuments crumble, even the greatest lives dissolve with time. The teachings of impermanence make this very clear. Everything that arises passes away. Everything, including memory, including legacy, including the idea that something you do now can make you eternal. And yet, we still chase it. We pour years into building a brand, a reputation, a contribution. We try to shape how people will think of us. But in doing that, we often miss the very life we're trying to make meaningful. We trade the present for an imagined future that may never come. We suffer to be remembered instead of living fully now. This is where egoic death becomes liberation. When you stop needing to be someone in the future, you can finally be no one in the moment. Not in a nihilistic way, but in a deeply peaceful way. You're not trying to win a place in history. You're not competing with time. You're not building a tower out of accomplishments so that someone, somewhere will say, they mattered. You've already let that go. And what's left when that craving dissolves? Stillness, clarity, a deep intimacy with now. You wash a dish without thinking about legacy. You care for someone without needing credit. You write, build, create, not for applause, but because it's a way of loving this moment. The act becomes its own meaning. The gesture becomes its own reward. There's no future chasing it, no name hiding behind it, just presence. This level of detachment may sound extreme, but it's not cold, it's not empty, it's freeing. Because you start to see that legacy isn't something you need to manage. It's something that arises on its own, if it needs to. If something you did touches someone else, let it. But you don't hold on to that. You don't base your life on it. You don't feed your sense of self with it. Because if you do, you're still clinging, still hoping to last. And nothing lasts. The monks who sweep temples know this. They sweep not to leave a mark, but because the floor is dusty. The teachers who pass on the Dharma know this. They teach not to become immortal, but because the truth is worth sharing, even if no one remembers who said it. That's the shift. You go from doing things for yourself to doing things from presence, from love, from understanding. Letting go of legacy also softens your relationship with death, because what's often behind the craving to be remembered is the fear of disappearing, the fear of being nothing. But Buddhism teaches that you've never been a separate, fixed thing to begin with. You're not a solid self. You're a process, a wave in the ocean. When the wave falls, it doesn't vanish, it returns. And if you stop holding so tightly to the idea of a self that needs to persist, death becomes less of a threat. It becomes another moment, another letting go. When you die before you die, you stop fearing death, because the ego already dissolved. The self you thought needed to survive already fell away. And what's left isn't scared. It's quiet. It's spacious. It's the same awareness that's always been here, before your name, before your roles, before your legacy. That's the part of you that doesn't need to be remembered, because it was never separate to begin with. And from that place, life becomes lighter. You stop clinging to every decision as if it defines you forever. You stop needing every project to be your masterpiece. You stop looking for significance in every move. You just live, fully, honestly, presently. You love someone and let that love be enough. Not because it will be remembered, but because it was real. You create something and let it go. Not because it will last, but because it was true. You show up for your life, not to leave a mark, but to feel it while it's here. And in that space, something ironic happens. The less you care about legacy, the more impact you tend to have. Not because you tried, but because your presence is deep. Your actions are pure. You're not performing. You're not manipulating. You're just living from a place of truth. And that truth moves people, whether they remember your name or not. This isn't about erasing your personality or pretending you don't care about contribution. It's about seeing clearly where your motivation is coming from. Is it rooted in fear, in the need to be someone special, in the desire to outlive yourself? Or is it rooted in love, in the simple wish to meet this moment with awareness? The beauty of letting go of legacy is that it leaves you free to live for what matters now. Relationships, integrity, stillness, joy, compassion. These aren't things you can leave behind in a monument, but they're the things that make your life feel full. And when you meet the end of your life with those things in your heart, you won't be worried about how you'll be remembered. You'll be at peace. because you lived, not for applause, not for eternity, but for truth. And that's the quiet power of egoic death. It doesn't take anything from you. It gives you back everything you forgot you already had. It doesn't erase you. It reveals who you are beneath the story. And once the story ends, once the craving for legacy dissolves, what remains is the only thing that's ever been real. This breath, this presence, this love. And now, from this place of ego dissolved and presence sharpened, we step into a deeper layer of freedom, not just from the past or the future, but from the sting of insult, judgment, and harm. Because the next step is learning how to walk through the world with a mind so empty, even criticism can't stick. When the craving to be remembered fades, when the pressure to leave a mark dissolves, a different kind of lightness begins to take shape. You're no longer driven by legacy or applause. You start living with an ease that isn't weighed down by the future. But then life offers something else to test you, something immediate. You release the need to be seen, and suddenly you're misunderstood. You drop the desire to be important, and someone insults you. You let go of your identity, and someone challenges who you are. And here's where the next layer of freedom waits. Because letting go of what others think in theory is one thing. Letting go when their words cut deep, that's something else entirely. That's where Zen steps in. There's an old Zen story about a man rowing across a misty river. As he moves through the fog, another boat comes drifting toward him. He calls out, warning the other rower, trying to avoid a collision. But the boat keeps coming, unresponsive. It crashes into his. He's about to explode in anger until he realizes the boat is empty. No one was steering. No one ignored him. There was never an enemy. And in that moment, the anger vanishes. This is the practice of the empty boat, not just as a parable, but as a way of moving through life. When you stop taking things personally, your stress drops, your reactivity fades, your peace deepens, not because life becomes easier, but because you're no longer fighting every insult, defending every opinion, resisting every word that doesn't match your image. Taking things personally is one of the most common and destructive mental habits. It shows up in a flash. Someone makes a comment, and suddenly your body tenses, your chest tightens, your mind starts building a story. Why would they say that? How dare they? What's wrong with me? And without realizing it, you've handed your peace over to a sentence, to a tone, to a look. But if you examine that moment closely, you'll see that what hurts isn't the words, it's what you believe about them, the way they hit your identity, the way they tap into old wounds, the meaning you attach to them. Zen teaches that this hurt can be released, not by toughening up, not by pretending you don't care, but by becoming like the empty boat, by letting go of the assumption that everything is about you, because most of the time, it's not. People speak from their conditioning, from their mood, from their past, from their projections, and when you don't add yourself into their behavior, it loses its power to wound. This doesn't mean you don't feel. It means you stop inflating the feeling with interpretation. It means you catch the moment your ego tries to turn an insult into a story about your worth. You stop chasing explanations. You stop needing to fix the way others see you. You let their words drift by like leaves on a stream without trying to hold or resist. Becoming psychologically empty is not about absence. It's about spaciousness. It's the ability to hear something difficult and still remain grounded, still remain soft, still remain inwardly free. When the mind is empty, insults have nowhere to land. They bounce off. Not because you're cold, but because there's nothing clinging. You're not trying to prove anything. You're not reacting to defend something fragile. You've already dropped the identity that needed defending. This is one of the most radical practices in Zen. Let the self go so completely that even offense can't find you. That doesn't mean becoming passive. You can still respond when needed. You can still speak with clarity. But the reaction, full of heat and blame and self-protection, that's what dissolves. That's what burns up in the light of emptiness. This is why Zen masters often speak in paradoxes. They don't explain because explanation reinforces the self. They nudge you into a space where logic fades and awareness sharpens, where you experience freedom not as an idea, but as a felt truth. When the mind is truly empty, not empty of life, but empty of identity, everything flows more cleanly. A harsh comment arises. You hear it. You feel the wave. And then, nothing. No story. No clinging. Just space. This level of freedom doesn't come overnight. It's trained, grown through practice, through pausing when the heat rises, through observing the mind's rush to personalize, through asking yourself quietly, is this really about me? Often, you'll find it's not. It's about someone else's pain, someone else's history, or just the randomness of life. The ego resists this. It wants everything to mean something. It wants to be the center, even when it's suffering. So it interprets, it dramatizes, it turns a passing moment into an identity crisis. But the more you see that happening, the more you can step out of the loop. You can return to stillness, return to breath, return to the view that sees the whole picture, not just the wounded part. This doesn't mean you don't have boundaries. It means your boundaries are clean, not made of reaction, but made of wisdom. You know when to speak and when to stay quiet. You know when to walk away and when to stay grounded. Because you're not being pulled by ego, you're anchored in awareness. You're responding, not resisting. Some insults are sharp. Some criticism feels deeply unfair. But that doesn't mean you have to carry it. The moment you take it personally, you've added weight. You've made it yours. But if you let it pass through, acknowledged but not absorbed, it loses its stickiness. It becomes just another moment, just another boat drifting by. And you start to see how often people are reacting to their own suffering, how rarely it's actually about you. Even those closest to you, they're projecting old pain, old fear, old patterns. When you stop taking it personally, you start seeing them with compassion. You stop needing to defend yourself, and you start seeing their wound, their struggle, their confusion. And even if you still need distance, you hold that space without anger, without blame, without adding your own suffering to theirs. The empty boat is not numb. It's deeply alive, but it's not entangled. It moves through the world with clarity and grace, not because the world is always kind, but because it doesn't need the world to be kind to feel peace. That's the power of this practice. You become unshakable, not because you dominate life, but because you stop trying to control it. You stop needing everyone to understand you. You stop needing to be right or liked or validated. You just move, like the boat in the river, steady and free. This practice also brings honesty, because once you stop taking things personally, you can hear what's true. Not everything said in criticism is wrong. Sometimes there's a grain of wisdom, a mirror, a chance to grow. But if your ego is in the way, you won't see it. You'll be too busy defending, too busy trying to feel safe. But when your mind is empty, you can hear what's real without collapse. You can accept feedback without fear. You can evolve without resistance. That's when humility arises, not as a weakness, but as strength. You're not afraid to be wrong. You're not afraid to adjust, because you're not clinging to a perfect self-image. You're not building a fortress around your name. You're living openly, willing to be shaped, willing to change, willing to let go. And this creates a ripple. People feel it. They feel your calm, your steadiness, your refusal to escalate. And it invites them into their own stillness, their own reflection. You stop feeding the fires of drama. You stop passing the pain along. You become a space where stress dissolves instead of spreads. That's the silent teaching of the empty boat, not through words, but through presence. It's not a glamorous path. There's no applause for being the one who doesn't react. But there's peace. There's lightness. There's freedom in not needing to carry every comment, every misunderstanding, every attack. You let people be. You let yourself be. And the river flows on. So this is the invitation. Next time you feel the surge of reaction, pause. Let the boat pass. Let the story dissolve. Let the space between stimulus and response grow wide. And in that space, feel your power. The power to not react. The power to stay open. The power to choose peace over and over again. And now that this peace has settled deeper into your being, not as a concept, but as a living truth, it's time to look at the next trap, one that hides inside your spiritual path. Because even awakening can become a possession. Even the search for truth can become a mask. And the next layer of letting go means even releasing the self that thinks it's evolving. Letting go of the need to defend yourself, to prove your worth in the face of criticism, creates a spaciousness that feels like peace. The mind no longer rushes to react. The heart no longer tightens with every harsh word. There's clarity, there's stillness. But in that silence, something unexpected can begin to stir. A new identity begins to whisper, quieter than the rest, but even more convincing. The identity of the awakened one, the seeker, the spiritual person. And without realizing it, the ego returns, dressed in robes instead of armor. This next form of attachment is subtle, refined, and often mistaken for progress. It's the attachment to spirituality itself, and it's just as heavy as all the others. Spiritual materialism is a term that cuts deep. It describes the tendency to use spiritual ideas, practices, and experiences as a way to strengthen the very self you're trying to dissolve. It's when the path becomes another performance, when meditation becomes a badge, when awakening becomes a trophy. It's not always loud. Sometimes it hides in language, saying the right things, reading the right books, surrounding yourself with the right teachers. But beneath it all is still the same craving, to be someone, to become special, to finally feel complete, not by letting go of identity, but by upgrading it. This is one of the greatest traps on the path, because it looks like freedom, but it's still bondage. You're still measuring, still comparing, still needing progress to validate your worth. You chase peak experiences. You collect techniques. You talk about non-duality, while secretly hoping people see how wise you've become. The ego, clever as ever, adapts. It shifts from worldly roles to spiritual ones, but it doesn't disappear. It just puts on a new mask. True practice is about unmasking completely, letting go not just of material attachment, but of the internal hunger to possess truth. Because even the idea of awakening can become something you try to own, something you try to achieve. You might think you're shedding layers, but if you're doing it to become more enlightened than others, you've built a new identity from the very thing that was meant to free you. The Buddhist path doesn't offer enlightenment as a product. It points to the emptiness of all phenomena, including the desire to be enlightened. When the Buddha spoke of liberation, he didn't mean arriving at a perfect version of yourself. He meant the end of grasping, the end of needing to become anything at all. This is why advanced practice often feels like coming full circle. You start by seeking peace. Then you gather tools. Then you let go of everything, even the tools, even the seeking. Because the seeking mind can't find what's already here. It keeps postponing freedom by turning it into a goal. But presence isn't a goal. It's what's left when there's no more striving. Letting go of spiritual materialism means questioning even your deepest intentions. Are you meditating to look peaceful? Are you helping others so you can feel superior? Are you avoiding real-world discomfort by hiding in philosophy? These questions aren't meant to judge. They're meant to illuminate, to bring honesty back to the center of your practice. The ego wants progress it can measure. It wants experiences it can describe. But awakening doesn't work that way. It's not about stacking insights. It's about seeing the futility of all stacking. It's not about building a stronger version of yourself. It's about seeing there is no permanent self to strengthen. And once you see that, the whole game falls apart. There's humility in this, real humility. Not the kind you talk about, but the kind that shows up when you realize you don't know anything for sure, that you're not above others, that your insights don't make you more valuable. They just make you quieter, softer, less reactive, more present. And presence doesn't need to be advertised. It radiates without effort. Spiritual materialism often creeps in when the mind gets uncomfortable with not knowing. So it fills the gap with theories, practices, lineages. It creates structure where there's only silence. It clings to the words of teachers instead of listening directly to this moment. But the deepest teachings always point back to this. Drop even the teaching. Drop even the map. Trust the silence. This is why some of the greatest masters said almost nothing. They didn't perform. They didn't lecture endlessly. They simply lived, free from self-image. Their presence did more than their words ever could, because they weren't trying to impress. They had nothing to gain. And that emptiness, real emptiness, is what wakes others up. You don't have to become a master to feel this. You just have to notice where you're still reaching, where you're still trying to turn truth into a possession, where you're still using practice to avoid parts of yourself. The moment you see it clearly, you have a choice. Keep reaching or stop. Keep building or let it fall. Letting it fall is terrifying at first. You've worked so hard. You've read so much. You've meditated, fasted, prayed, studied, and to hear that none of it matters, not in the way you thought, is destabilizing. But it's also the beginning of real freedom, because now you're no longer trying to earn peace. You're no longer trying to prove anything, not to others, not to yourself. You're just here. Here is enough. This breath, this stillness, this fleeting moment of being. You don't need enlightenment to be whole. You don't need a new identity to be at peace. You need only to stop pretending. Stop pretending you're almost there. Stop pretending awakening is far away. Stop pretending your worth is tied to your level of insight. This honesty is radical, and it's rare, because there's no social reward for it. No one gives you applause for saying, "I don't know. I'm not special. I'm not above suffering." But this honesty is where real transformation begins. It's the point where you stop climbing and start resting, not out of laziness, but out of wisdom. Resting doesn't mean you stop practicing. It means your practice becomes clean. It's no longer driven by craving. It's no longer about getting somewhere. It's simply an expression of presence. You sit because sitting is enough. You breathe because breathing is alive. You walk because walking is sacred. There's no destination, no final awakening, just this, Even the desire to awaken can be let go, not because awakening isn't real, but because clinging to it creates separation. The more you chase it, the more it becomes a concept. But true awakening is not a concept. It's the end of concepts. It's not a state. It's the clarity that no fixed state will ever satisfy the mind that keeps searching. And so you stop, not with force, but with grace. You let the whole structure collapse, the identity, the performance, the spiritual resume. And what's left isn't emptiness in the painful sense. It's openness, receptivity, freedom that doesn't need to be labeled. Freedom that doesn't need a name is the most free of all. This is where the heart softens, where comparison ends, where effort returns to simplicity. You stop watching yourself. You stop trying to be mindful. You just are. Awake, not because you achieved it, but because you stopped avoiding it. And in that stopping, you find the peace you were seeking through effort, the contentment you were trying to construct through practice. It was never something to be earned. It was always here, waiting for you to give up the search. So the invitation now is simple. Drop the costume, drop the goal, drop the idea that you are someone going somewhere spiritually. You're not on a ladder, you're not on a stage, you're already home. And from that home, with nothing left to prove or reach for, a new kind of peace begins to unfold. Not because you built it, but because you finally stopped covering it. And now that the layers of identity, defense, achievement, and spiritual striving have been peeled away, we begin to step into something even more radical, a space beyond goals, beyond productivity, beyond becoming. A quiet joy found not in doing more, but in the sacred practice of doing nothing at all. Once the illusion of becoming falls away, even becoming enlightened, what's left is so quiet, it's often overlooked. No more seeking, no more pretending to be further along than you are, no more dressing up your ego in the clothes of wisdom. What remains is simple presence. But the moment everything falls away, the mind often asks a question it's asked your entire life. Now what? If you're not improving, not progressing, not building a legacy, not climbing towards spiritual goals, then what are you doing here? What's the point of being at all? And this is where the deepest layer of freedom begins, not in doing more, but in letting go of needing to do anything at all. This is where the practice of sacred uselessness begins. The very structure of modern life conditions you to be useful, to be productive, to have a purpose, an outcome, a measurable result. You're told that if you can define your goals and work hard toward them, your life will be meaningful, and if you don't, you're wasting time. But the Buddhist path, especially in its most radical forms, invites you to question that entire mindset. It says that the obsession with purpose might be the very thing keeping you restless, that needing every moment to mean something may be what's making peace feel so far away. Some Buddhist masters, especially in the Zen tradition, speak of doing things for no reason. They teach tasks that serve no end. They sit for hours without a goal. They walk not to get anywhere. They sweep not to clean. These practices aren't empty repetition. They're sacred precisely because they're free of outcome, because in letting go of utility, something rare happens. The present becomes enough. The act itself becomes complete. No future is needed to justify this moment. This might sound pointless. That's the point. The mind, trained by culture and habit, resists it fiercely. It wants direction. It wants accomplishment. It wants to say, I did this, and it led to that. But what if there is no next step? What if the deepest wisdom is found in the step you're taking right now? when you stop trying to turn it into anything else. Uselessness in this sense is not failure, it's freedom. You're not passive, you're fully alive. But you're no longer filtering your experience through its productivity. You're no longer asking every breath, every gesture, every hour to justify itself. You're not using the present to buy a better future. You're just being. And this being is not lazy. It's awake. It's deeply intimate with life. You taste your tea without thinking about your to-do list. You listen to a bird without trying to name the species. You walk without tracking your steps. You breathe without manipulating your breath. And in doing so, you stop turning your life into a transaction. You stop measuring everything by its outcome. This practice is hard for a busy mind. It wants to turn everything into a project. Even meditation becomes a method. Even rest becomes strategic. But sacred uselessness invites you to strip that away. To sit, to breathe, to smile. Not because it will lead to a better version of yourself, but because this moment is whole, even if it leads nowhere. It's not about doing nothing. It's about doing without striving, without evaluation, without the inner voice asking, "What will this get me?" When you drop that voice, what's left is joy. Not the joy of achievement, but the joy of aliveness. The joy of being free from the inner judge that's always calculating your worth. This shift is radical because you've spent years, maybe decades, chasing usefulness. You've defined your value by what you produce, what you achieve, what you prove. And stepping out of that race feels disorienting. You feel guilty for resting. You feel afraid to stop pushing. But the truth is, peace doesn't come from pushing. It comes from presence. And presence needs no reason to be here. Some monks spend hours arranging rocks in a garden, not for art, not for visitors, just because the moment called for it. And when it's done, they may sweep it away. That gesture is powerful, not because it accomplishes anything, but because it's done with full attention and no clinging. That's sacred uselessness. The freedom to act without calculation. The freedom to create without attachment. The freedom to be without performance. Letting go of usefulness doesn't mean you stop engaging with life. It means you stop turning life into a ladder. You stop relating to yourself as a project. You stop needing every experience to be a means to something else. You allow what's here to be enough, even if it doesn't lead anywhere. And paradoxically, this leads to more peace than any goal ever could. Because goals by nature postpone peace. They say, "I'll be okay when," "I'll rest after," "I'll feel worthy once." But presence says, this is already it. No upgrades required, no improvements needed. Not because you've given up, but because you've seen through the lie that your life must constantly be improved to be valuable. This doesn't mean you can't have aspirations, but it means the quality of your life is no longer measured by progress. It's measured by presence, by the depth of your attention, by the softness of your heart, by the way you meet this moment without rushing past it. And this changes everything. It changes how you relate to work, to relationships, to your own thoughts. You stop multitasking. You stop splitting your focus. You begin to bring your full self into simple moments, not because they'll pay off, but because they're alive. This turns walking into a form of prayer. This turns washing dishes into a sacred act. This turns a silent afternoon into a gift instead of a waste. The mind will resist. It will say, "You're falling behind. You're not growing. You're not being productive." But those thoughts are habits, not truth. You can meet them gently, without believing them. You can smile and return to your breath. Return to the feel of the wind, the weight of your body, the quiet of this second. And that returning is the real practice, not to build something, but to stop needing to build anything at all. And here's the secret. When you stop trying to be useful, you often become more available, more authentic, more generous, because you're no longer serving your image. You're no longer giving to get something. You're just present. And in that presence, others feel safe. They feel seen. They feel your depth, not as a performance, but as a presence that doesn't need to prove itself. This is why some of the most impactful people don't seem to be trying. They're not pushing. They're not posturing. They're just fully there. And that fullness is enough. That quiet availability becomes medicine to those who are still trapped in striving. You don't need to tell them anything. Your way of being speaks louder than your words ever could. The practice of sacred uselessness is also deeply healing, because it lets the nervous system rest. It tells the body, you don't have to be on alert. You're allowed to just exist. And in that rest, the body softens, the breath deepens, the heart opens, and healing happens. Not because you tried to make it happen, but because you stopped interfering. You're not a machine. You're not a business. You're not a list of goals. You're a field of awareness, a wave of consciousness, a moment of life that doesn't need to be packaged or improved. And the more you live from that truth, the more joy begins to rise. Quietly, gently, naturally. Not because you earned it, but because you finally allowed it. This joy has no reason. It's not about something. It doesn't point to the future. It's just here, like sunlight on your skin, like breath in your lungs, like silence that doesn't need to be filled. So now, after all the striving, all the letting go, all the peeling back of layers, you arrive here, not as someone who has figured it all out, but as someone who no longer needs to. You don't need your life to be useful. You don't need your presence to be justified. You don't need your being to have a purpose. You're allowed to simply be. And in that being, without a reason, without a plan, without a goal, you touch the deepest truth of all, that nothing needs to happen, that everything is already full, that the space between doing is where the real freedom lives. And from this place of presence with no agenda, we now begin to uncover something else that has shaped your restlessness all along. Not just your drive for purpose, but your deep attachment to what comes next, to the future, to the story ahead. Because even when everything seems calm, there's still the pull of hope. And in this next step, we look closely at how even hope can keep you from peace. When you no longer need to prove your worth through doing, when life no longer has to serve a purpose to be enough, something extraordinary unfolds. A deep stillness enters. You wake up not with pressure, but with presence. You move through your day without the constant question of, what am I doing this for? And in that freedom from purpose, you taste a quiet kind of joy. But even in this stillness, one thread often remains, one final thread tying the mind to restlessness, hope. Not the hope that lifts in moments of despair, but the subtle, constant leaning toward the future, a pull toward something better, different, later, a mental reaching that seems innocent, but underneath it carries the weight of dissatisfaction with what is. Hope sounds beautiful. It's celebrated in culture, in philosophy, in spiritual teachings. It's painted as light in the dark, the anchor that keeps us from sinking. But Buddhism invites a radical shift in how we see it, not to strip life of optimism, but to expose how even hope can become a chain. Because hope is still a craving for something other than what's here, a refusal to rest completely in the now. And until that craving is seen and released, peace will always feel just slightly out of reach. The mind loves to move forward. It dreams, it plans, it anticipates, and none of that is inherently wrong. But when hope turns into grasping, when it becomes an emotional strategy to escape discomfort, it binds you just as much as fear does. In fact, hope and fear are two sides of the same attachment. Both are based on imagining a future and resisting the present. Hope says, things will get better. Fear says, things will get worse. Both assume that this is not enough, that now must be improved or fixed. But the deeper the practice becomes, the clearer it is. Peace doesn't arrive when the future does. It arrives when the need for the future releases its grip. This doesn't mean you stop moving through life. You still take care of your responsibilities. You still plant seeds, but you no longer lean on the outcome. You no longer build your emotional stability on what might happen next. You no longer carry that quiet ache that says, "I'll be okay when..." Because that ache is where suffering lives. It creates a delay between your experience and your presence. It puts peace on hold. It makes you believe that what you have now is only a bridge to something better. And so you miss it. You miss the ordinary beauty, the quiet miracles, the texture of each moment that can only be felt when you stop leaning forward. Letting go of hope in this way is not cynicism. It's clarity. It's seeing that craving for a different future, even a brighter one, still creates tension, still creates comparison, still creates absence from your own life. Hope is tricky because it feels soft. It feels like love. But often it's fear in disguise. Fear that if you don't imagine something better, you'll collapse. Fear that if you let go of your vision, you'll lose your direction. But direction can exist without attachment. Movement can happen without grasping. You can still care deeply. You can still act. But without the hunger that something has to change for you to feel whole. This level of release can feel disorienting at first. If you let go of hope, what holds you up? What keeps you moving? But look closely. You'll see that what holds you is not the imagined future. It's the strength of presence. It's the stability that comes not from expectation, but from attention. When you're fully here, you don't need a future to escape into. You already feel full. And that fullness is what the path points to over and over again. Not a future state, not a promised land, but this breath, this stillness, this now. You're not being asked to stop loving, to stop dreaming, to stop caring. You're being invited to stop postponing your peace. You're being invited to meet your life directly without hoping it will turn into something else first. This also changes how you relate to time. When hope loosens, time softens. It's no longer a straight line pulling you toward better versions of yourself. It becomes spacious, circular, alive. You stop trying to race against time. You stop measuring your progress. You live without needing to hurry, because there's nothing missing, nothing on its way, just this unfolding moment, endlessly arriving. Even healing becomes different. When hope fades, you stop saying, "One day I'll feel okay." You start noticing where okayness already lives in your body. You start listening to the parts that don't need to be fixed. You begin to honor the rhythm of your life, not the one your mind imagined, but the one unfolding now. Healing is no longer something you chase. It's something you recognize, something already happening beneath the surface of your striving. Letting go of hope also frees you from subtle self-judgment, because hope often says, "I'll accept myself once I'm better." It creates a distance between who you are and who you think you need to be. But when hope dissolves, so does that distance. You start to feel compassion for yourself exactly as you are, not as a project, not as someone on the way to being whole, but as someone already whole, even in your confusion, your sadness, your flaws. This is not easy. The mind resists. It says, "Without hope, won't I become passive? Won't I stop caring?" But it's the opposite. When you stop projecting into the future, you have more energy for now, more space to be fully present with what needs attention. You care more, not less, because your care is rooted in what's real, not what's imagined. Hope often numbs us. It keeps us from fully grieving, fully facing, fully accepting what is. It says, "This will pass," and that may be true, but it doesn't allow us to meet this moment with the honesty it deserves. Letting go of hope means you can sit with sorrow without rushing to the silver lining. You can face loss without needing to spiritualize it. You can breathe into pain without promising yourself it will go away. And paradoxically, this creates more peace, not less. Because peace isn't the absence of difficulty, it's the absence of resistance. When you stop needing the next thing to fix this one, you can finally rest. This kind of rest is radical. It breaks the cycle of postponement. It removes the pressure from your chest. It makes space for joy, not because something wonderful is coming, but because something simple is already here. The sound of the wind, the warmth of your breath, the way light touches the wall. None of it needs to promise a better future to be sacred. You're not being asked to give up your vision. You're being asked to stop making your peace depend on it. You're not being asked to stop caring about the future. You're being asked to stop needing it to be different than now, because clinging to what might be is what keeps you from what already is. Hope says, "I'll be free when." The path says, freedom is already here, underneath the when. So you let the clinging loosen. You let the story soften. You let the imagined future dissolve, breath by breath. And what remains is not despair, it's stillness. What remains is not emptiness, but intimacy with life as it is. And now, from this place of intimacy, with nothing left to chase, nothing left to become, we begin to listen more closely, not just to thoughts or feelings, but to the space between them. A silence you may have overlooked your entire life. A silence that doesn't need fixing. A silence that points to the truth beyond the grasping mind. When the grip of hope finally loosens and your mind no longer waits for the next moment to bring peace, something rare begins to surface. A deeper quiet. Not the silence of boredom, but the kind that feels full, vast, and awake. In that silence, your senses start to open. You hear more clearly. You see without distortion. You touch each moment without needing it to transform. But just as you begin to rest there, something interrupts it. A voice. Not outside, but inside. A steady, familiar stream that narrates your life, judges your every move, predicts your future, replays your past. This voice seems so normal, you hardly question it. But this is the next veil, the inner narrator. That subtle commentator in your mind that's been speaking over every moment of your life, convincing you that it's you, and it's not. The voice in your head is not the problem. The attachment to it is, because you've mistaken it for who you are. The mind talks, and you listen. It tells stories about you, about others, about what will go wrong or how things should have been. And over time, those stories become a self. Not because they're true, but because they're repeated. This is the illusion Buddhism helps you see through, not by silencing the voice, but by stepping back far enough to realize you're not the one speaking, you're the one who hears it. This realization changes everything. Most people spend their entire lives reacting to that voice. They try to negotiate with it, correct it, believe it, or suppress it. But the real practice is none of those. The real practice is detachment, not in a cold way, but in a freeing way. The moment you see that the voice is just a conditioned stream of thoughts, not truth, not self, not reality, you gain space, you gain choice, you gain the ability to watch without being pulled in. Vipassana, one of the most direct and powerful meditation techniques in Buddhism, is designed exactly for this. It trains you to observe, not to think, not to fix, but to witness. You sit, you breathe, you notice what arises. A thought appears. This is boring. You don't follow it. You don't argue with it. You don't try to stop it. You just see it. It comes, it passes, and you remain. And this observation begins to expose the mind's habits. You start to notice how the inner narrator isn't just talking, it's interpreting, labeling, comparing. It's creating tension out of neutral events. It's narrating your emotions instead of letting you feel them. It's commenting on silence instead of allowing you to rest in it. It's constantly pulling your attention into a mental world that feels like reality, but is actually just commentary. The danger isn't that the narrator exists. The danger is believing it. You believe it when it says you're not good enough. You believe it when it says they don't care. You believe it when it predicts disaster. And because you believe it, you suffer. But look closer. How many times has the narrator been wrong? How many predictions never happened? How many self-criticisms were based on old wounds, not present truth? The voice isn't evil, it's just conditioned. It's a collection of past impressions, fears, hopes, and cultural noise. And it's not personal, it's mechanical. This is where detachment becomes powerful. When you stop identifying with the voice, it loses power. It might still speak, but it doesn't shake you. You hear it like you'd hear a radio in another room. Noise, not truth. And in that space, something deeper begins to arise. Your direct experience, not filtered by the narrator, just pure awareness. The feeling of your breath, the warmth of your hands, the sound of wind. Life before the mind describes it. This pure experience is your home, and it's always been here underneath the commentary. But it gets buried by thought, because thought feels so loud, so important. It tells you that you must listen, that you must obey, that you'll lose control if you stop following. But what actually happens is the opposite. You become more grounded, more clear, more present, because now you're acting from awareness, not reacting from mental noise. You begin to see that much of your stress was not about life itself, but about your thoughts about life, not about what happened, but about what the narrator said about it, not about who you are, but about the role the voice kept rehearsing. And when that's seen clearly, you don't have to fight it. You just don't give it your energy anymore. You stop feeding the story. This is a major shift in identity. You no longer see yourself as the thinker. You see yourself as the awareness in which thinking happens. This awareness is vast. It holds everything, thoughts, feelings, sensations, but it isn't defined by any of them. It allows everything, resists nothing, and clings to nothing. And from here, the voice becomes what it always was, just passing sound. Of course, the voice will try to pull you back. It will say, "You're not doing this right. This doesn't feel spiritual enough. You're wasting time." And you'll notice, those are just more thoughts. The narrator is trying to protect itself, trying to stay relevant. But once you've seen through the illusion, you can just smile. Let it speak. Let it fade. You're not at war with it. You're just not trapped by it. This also shifts how you relate to other people, because most of your reactions to them are filtered through your narrator. You think they're judging you because your inner voice is judging you. You think they're not listening because your inner voice isn't present. But when that voice quiets, you see others more clearly. You hear without interpretation. You feel without projection. You respond from presence, not defense. And this makes connection possible. Real connection. Because now there's no script, no inner monologue rehearsing the conversation. No need to manage your image while you speak. You're just here, alive, listening, honest. And that honesty brings peace. You no longer need to manage the voice. You no longer need to escape it. You've stopped identifying with it. And that's the most powerful shift of all. Because now you can rest, not in thought, but in awareness, not in ideas, but in presence, not in story, but in silence. And from that silence, life unfolds naturally, not narrated, not controlled, just lived. You don't need to eliminate the narrator. That's just more control, more struggle. You just need to see it clearly. With every thought that comes, notice, this is not me, this is a voice. And with every breath, return to the body, to the senses, to the space that holds it all. This is the practice, simple, not easy, but profound. Over time, the voice becomes quieter, not because it's been silenced, but because it's no longer the center. It's no longer believed, and the silence that remains isn't empty. It's full of life, full of clarity, full of the presence that doesn't need to be narrated to be real. And now, from this spaciousness, from the release of the mental storyteller, you're ready to go even deeper, to explore not just what arises within thought, but what exists in the gaps between them, to rest not in what appears, but in the stillness that holds it all. Because sometimes the greatest freedom isn't found in what you know, but in the space where nothing is known. When the voice in your head loses its grip, when you no longer mistake the constant narration for your true self, you begin to feel something you may not have known for a long time: space. Not the kind of space filled with stimulation or entertainment, but the quiet, simple kind that has no drama in it. For many, this feels both liberating and unfamiliar, because beneath all the noise, the mind starts to crave something else, something new, something to break the stillness. This craving is subtle but powerful. It disguises itself as restlessness, discontent, or a need for inspiration. But underneath, it's just one more way the ego tries to stay busy. And this next layer of practice meets that craving directly, not with more novelty, but with the courage to meet the same moment again and again. This is where the Zen path opens into the most misunderstood form of freedom: monotony. Modern life feeds on the new. It's designed around stimulation, upgrades, constant change. You're encouraged to chase the next thing, improve every area of life, reinvent yourself daily. Even in subtle ways, there's pressure to escape sameness. But repetition, when seen through the eyes of presence, is not a trap. It's a teacher, a doorway, and in Zen, it's considered one of the most direct paths to awakening. Not because it entertains the mind, but because it wears it down until only presence remains. Repetition is what reveals your relationship with boredom, and boredom is rarely about what's happening. It's about your refusal to be with it. It's resistance disguised as disinterest. When you're bored, you're not really paying attention. You're comparing the present moment to an idea of how things should be. You want more. You want different. And that want creates tension. That tension is what most people call suffering. But Zen teaches something different. It says the same action, repeated with full awareness, can become sacred. The same breath, the same walk, the same bowl of rice. It can all become a portal to freedom if you're willing to stay present with it. The mind may scream for change, but the heart settles into rhythm. The body knows how to follow cycles. It breathes, it beats, it moves in patterns. And when you sync with those patterns instead of resisting them, you fall into alignment with life itself. Doing the same thing again and again teaches humility. You're not performing, you're not impressing, you're just here, folding the same robes, sweeping the same floor, bowing in the same way each day. And as the mind stops searching for reward or variety, your awareness sharpens. You begin to notice the texture of the broom handle, the sound of cloth against skin, the way your muscles shift slightly each time. What once seemed repetitive becomes alive, because you're finally paying attention. This is not passive. It's the most engaged form of living. It doesn't reject change. It simply no longer demands it. It meets each moment as it is, not to manipulate it, but to merge with it. And in that merging, something profound happens. Peace. Not the kind of peace that comes after everything works out. The kind that arises when you stop needing anything to change. This is also how suffering softens, because suffering often grows in the spaces where you believe something is missing. You think the present is lacking, so your mind searches. More pleasure, more intensity, more insight. But repetition reveals that nothing is lacking. It just hasn't been seen clearly yet. When you stay with the same task, not once, but 1,000 times, it stops being boring. It starts becoming intimate. You begin to see its layers, its detail, its life. Zen monks wake at the same time, eat the same food, sit in the same posture, not because it's easy, but because it strips away the illusion that novelty brings freedom. What it brings is distraction, temporary satisfaction, and then another hunger. The cycle repeats, and your attention is pulled further and further from stillness. But monotony brings you back, slowly, patiently. Every time you return to the breath, to the walk, to the tea, you train your mind to stop craving a different now. You train your nervous system to relax into what's here. And over time, this becomes natural, effortless, not because you forced it, but because you surrendered to it. Repetition also exposes the mind's patterns, how quickly it gets irritated, how it narrates the same judgments, how it spins stories to escape silence. When you do the same thing over and over, you can't hide. You see yourself clearly. You see your reactions, your avoidance, your restlessness. And that seeing is a gift, because once you see the pattern, you can stop feeding it. There is also something deeply grounding about repetition. It anchors you in the body, in rhythm, in now. You stop living in fantasy. You stop floating in mental noise. You return to this place, this task, this breath. And in doing so, you create stability, not through control, but through surrender. This stability is rare in a world built on upgrades, but it's what the soul craves. Not stimulation, not adrenaline, but consistency, stillness, predictability. These things aren't boring when they're lived fully. They're calming, they're nourishing, they're safe. And from that safety, joy arises. Not the sharp, ecstatic kind, but the quiet contentment that comes from being undivided. You're not split between this moment and the next. You're not waiting for something new to validate your life. You're just here, and that's enough. Even creativity begins to change. It's no longer a product of novelty. It becomes an extension of presence. You're not trying to be original. You're simply expressing the depth of what you're seeing. And that depth only comes from repetition, from staying, from looking at the same thing long enough that its surface cracks and something sacred shines through. Monotony also builds resilience. You stop needing conditions to be exciting. You stop needing moods to cooperate. You show up regardless, and that showing up becomes its own reward. Not because it changes things, but because it reveals what never changes: your awareness, your breath, your capacity to meet life directly. In this way, repetition becomes devotion, not to an idea, not to a goal, but to presence itself. Each repeated act becomes a bow to now. Each ordinary movement becomes a prayer, not because you're spiritualizing it, but because you're finally seeing it, without filters, without distraction, just as it is. This path doesn't ask for extraordinary effort. It asks for ordinary attention, repeated, sustained, honest. It asks you to meet your life not as a means to something else, but as the destination itself. This is the end of boredom, not because life became more interesting, but because you became more present. This is the end of restlessness, not because you found what you were looking for, but because you stopped searching. So the same walk becomes sacred, the same meal becomes a meditation, the same sunrise becomes new, not because it changed, but because you did. You're no longer rushing past it. You're no longer waiting for the next thing. You're here, finally, and here is everything. And from this place of calm repetition, where the mind stops chasing and the heart opens to what is, we begin to see another layer that fuels our suffering. Not the desire for stimulation, but the belief that we must improve, grow, and become someone else. Because now we turn to the illusion of self-improvement and the surprising truth that the path to freedom isn't in becoming more, but in no longer needing to become anything at all. When life stops needing to impress you with something new, when the same walk, the same breath, the same stillness is no longer a problem, a new kind of peace begins to rise. One that isn't dramatic, one that doesn't depend on intensity or variety. It's a peace born from your willingness to stay, to be with what is, without needing it to change. And as that peace settles into your nervous system, something even subtler begins to stir. A thought, soft but persistent. Now that I've found stillness, how do I become even more? How do I grow from here? The mind, even after deep presence, still reaches for a goal. Not outward now, but inward. It starts dressing up its desire in the language of growth, of evolution, of self-improvement. But here, in this next layer of the path, Buddhism offers one of its most freeing truths. You don't need to improve, because the self you're trying to fix doesn't actually exist in the way you think it does. The idea of self-improvement sounds healthy. It sounds wise, even noble. You want to be kinder, more peaceful, less reactive. You want to meditate better, love more fully, live more authentically. These are beautiful intentions on the surface, but underneath them often lives a subtle rejection, a belief that who you are right now is not enough, that your current self is somehow lacking, flawed, incomplete. And from that belief, the endless cycle of internal fixing begins. You wake up and set goals. You meditate to become calmer. You journal to figure yourself out. You reflect, analyze, optimize. But often, the more you try to improve, the more fragmented you feel. Because self-improvement, when driven by a belief in a broken self, only strengthens that belief. You start chasing a future version of yourself that doesn't exist. You become the hamster in the spiritual wheel, always running toward wholeness, never arriving. Buddhism doesn't deny growth, but it points to a different kind of growth, one that's not about becoming more, but about seeing clearly. Not about constructing a better identity, but about dissolving the illusion of identity altogether. Because once you see that there is no solid fixed self to improve, the whole struggle drops. And what's left is not complacency. It's clarity. It's the freedom to be as you are, without the mental commentary that says you should be someone else. The illusion of progress comes from the same misunderstanding that fuels suffering, the belief in a permanent I. An I who is behind all thoughts, who owns all feelings, who lives like a central character in a never-ending story of becoming. But if you look closely, that I can never be found. There are thoughts, yes. Sensations, yes. Memories, yes. But where is the self that owns them? It's not in the body. It's not in the mind. It's a concept stitched together from habit and language. And the moment you begin to question it, not as a theory, but in lived experience, something shifts. You stop needing to improve a self that was never solid to begin with. You stop polishing the mirror and start resting as the space in which the mirror appears. The motivation to change transforms from compulsion to curiosity. You don't act from deficiency, you respond from awareness. This shift dissolves the anxiety of not being good enough, because that anxiety was never based on truth. It was based on comparison between who you are and who you think you should be. But the should is an idea, a fantasy, and chasing it always leaves you a little tired, a little behind. But the present moment has no should. It simply is, and in that simplicity, the burden of improvement falls away. Letting go of self-improvement doesn't mean you stop growing. It means growth no longer comes from pressure. It arises naturally, like flowers opening to the sun. No striving, just unfolding. You start eating better, not because you hate your body, but because you care for it. You meditate not to fix your mind, but because stillness is nourishing. You listen to others, not to become more compassionate, but because presence invites you to truly hear. Action still happens, but from love, not from lack. This is the kind of transformation that doesn't need charts or goals. It's not tracked. It's felt. It's quiet. You're no longer measuring yourself against an invisible ideal. You're simply living, responding, adjusting. Not because you're broken, but because life is dynamic and you're alive within it. This view also changes how you relate to your past, because so much of self-improvement is driven by trying to redeem the old self. You think, if I become better now, I can finally forgive who I was. But that, too, is a trap, because the person you were wasn't solid either. It was another stream of thought, of memory, of conditioned response. Just like now, there's nothing to redeem. There's only the present. And in this presence, even your history becomes softer, less defining, less sharp, more like a dream that no longer needs retelling. You also stop comparing yourself to others, because comparison depends on a belief in separate, fixed selves. But when that belief dissolves, so does the need to measure. You don't look at someone else's path and feel behind. You see that each expression of life is unique, arising from conditions, not from will. And your compassion deepens, not just for others, but for yourself. You stop asking, why aren't I further along? And start asking, what's here now? That question, what's here now, becomes the new compass. It replaces progress. It replaces striving. It brings you back from the illusion of becoming. Because everything you seek in your imagined future, peace, clarity, love, is already present here, waiting to be noticed. Not built, not earned, not added, just seen. This perspective also changes your relationship with discipline. You still show up, you still commit, but not out of guilt or ambition. You commit because presence asks for it, because awareness naturally returns to itself. Discipline becomes devotion, not duty. A joy, not a demand. And from that place, everything softens, even your ambition to awaken. Because even awakening, when seen as a goal, can become a prison. Another version of better, another layer of not yet. But real awakening is the seeing through of all goals, including that one. It's the moment you realize there's nothing more to chase, and in that realization, you relax, not into laziness, but into stillness, into the recognition that you are already home. The path doesn't disappear, it just becomes lighter. Each step taken not to arrive, but to walk. Each breath not to calm, but to feel. Each moment not to build the self, but to see that the self was never there. And from this emptiness, everything becomes alive. Not because it's new, but because you're finally present. So you stop fixing, you stop evaluating, you stop shaping yourself into a concept. You let go of the inner judge, the planner, the one who always needs to be a little better. You let all of them go, not by force, but by no longer feeding them. And what's left is presence, pure, simple, undivided. That presence is enough. And now, with the pressure to grow lifted, with the weight of improvement released, something even quieter begins to call you, not through thought, but through the space where thought ends. A place not between past and future, but between one breath and the next. A place that has been with you all along, unnoticed. The stillness between, the gap where silence speaks. And in the next step, we explore that silence, not as emptiness, but as the doorway to everything real. When you release the compulsion to fix yourself, when you no longer measure each breath against an ideal version of who you think you're supposed to become, the tension begins to dissolve. The chase ends, and with it, a gentler rhythm emerges, one that asks for nothing, proves nothing, and waits for no destination. But even in this new rhythm, something else becomes visible. Between the moments you label as progress and stillness, between each thought, between each breath, there's something else entirely. Something so easy to miss that most people never stop long enough to feel it. Not the thought, not the space filled with words, but the space just before the next one comes. This is not emptiness in the way the mind fears. It is presence without noise, the silent field between movements. And it's here, in this subtle and sacred pause, that a different kind of peace begins to unfold. The mind is rarely still. It jumps from one idea to the next, narrating, anticipating, recalling, reacting. Even when you rest, it fills the silence with commentary. But if you observe long enough, you'll notice something unexpected. Thoughts do not flow continuously. They rise and fall, and between each one, there's a gap, a pause. It may only last a second, maybe less, but it's there. And that tiny space is the entry point to the freedom Buddhism has pointed to for centuries. Most people never look there. They're too focused on what the thoughts say. They want to fix them, replace them, upgrade them. But Buddhism invites you to look beneath them, to observe the interval, not the content. Because while thoughts are conditioned, noisy, and often reactive, the space between them is untouched. It holds no agenda. It doesn't judge. It doesn't compare. It simply is. And in that stillness, you begin to sense what awareness feels like when it's not wrapped around an object. You might first notice this space during meditation. You sit. The thoughts come, as usual. Some are loud, some soft, some urgent. But if you stay still and watch, a moment arrives where nothing is happening. You're not lost in memory. You're not pulled toward the next plan. There's no story, just awareness, sitting quietly by itself. And for that brief moment, you're not thinking, you're simply being. This space is not created by effort. It reveals itself when effort stops. When you stop trying to think or stop thinking. When you let the mind move on its own and you step back far enough to see what's underneath. And what's underneath is not a blank void. It's the most alive part of you. It's where peace lives, not as an idea, but as a direct experience. The gap between thoughts is not empty in the way the world defines empty. It's not lacking. It's full of presence, of still awareness. It's what holds your entire experience, yet never asks to be noticed. It simply waits, quietly, between the movements of the mind. And when you finally rest there, even for a moment, you understand why Buddhist teachings place so much importance on awareness, not awareness of things, but awareness itself. This space also exists between emotions. When you're caught in sadness, there's often a pause before it becomes anger. When you're moving from fear to control, there's a slight hesitation. These micro moments are overlooked because they don't scream, they don't tell stories, but they're there. And in those pauses, there's an opening, a choice. Not a decision in the usual sense, but a chance to stay instead of react, to remain still instead of being pulled. These in-between moments are powerful because they are not conditioned by habit. Thoughts are shaped by memory. Emotions often follow old patterns, but the space between them is free, untouched by your past, unburdened by your plans. And when you train yourself to notice it, you start to live from it. Not all the time, but enough. Enough to see that peace doesn't come after the thought ends. It was there all along, hidden in the silence that wrapped around it. Resting in this space isn't about tuning out life. It's about tuning in more deeply than thought allows. Thought filters your experience. It divides, names, judges. The gap doesn't. It just offers itself as it is, spacious, clear, undivided. And in that, you rediscover your own nature, not as a thinker or a feeler, but as awareness itself. Buddhism teaches that the root of suffering is clinging, not just to objects, but to identity, to time, to mental movement. And the space between thoughts is the one place where clinging cannot survive. There's nothing to hold, nothing to fix, nothing to become. Just this moment, unclaimed and whole. To live from that space doesn't mean abandoning your life. It means carrying silence with you, letting it anchor your speech, letting it soften your reactions, letting it inform your decisions. You don't have to name every feeling. You don't have to follow every thought. You can simply pause, even in the middle of conversation, and return to that quiet. No one else needs to know. It's an internal shift, a subtle, sacred bow to presence. In daily life, the gap is always available. Before you speak, there's a breath. Before you open a door, a stillness. Before you respond to a message, a pause. These are not empty spaces to be filled. They are invitations, not to think more, but to think less. Not to do more, but to be more deeply in the doing. When you slow down enough to enter them, your entire relationship with time changes. Time feels heavy because it's filled with mental commentary. When you drop into the space between that commentary, time opens. One breath becomes enough. One step feels complete. The day slows down, not because there's less to do, but because you're no longer rushing through it in your mind. Meditation deepens this capacity, not by shutting down thought, but by watching it pass. And in the watching, you begin to sense the stillness it floats in, like clouds moving across a vast sky. You start to rest, not in the clouds, but in the sky itself. Thought may continue, but your identity shifts. You're no longer the one thinking, you're the one watching, and eventually not even watching, just being. This space between thoughts is not separate from your life. It is your life, before it gets named, before it gets divided. It's the original silence you were born with, the stillness that was never touched by fear or craving or ambition. The more you touch it, the more you trust it, not as something to reach, but as something to return to. You don't need to create the gap, you just need to stop filling it. Let the next thought come when it's ready. Let the next word arrive without force. Let your breath move without needing to control it. And in between, rest, even for a second, even for half a second. That pause is enough to shift your entire day. As this becomes more natural, you begin to live from a quieter place, not passive, not removed, just clear, aware, noticing without clinging, responding without rushing. You don't need to explain it. You don't need to make it special. It's already sacred, because it's already here. And from that stillness, your life continues. But not in the old way. You're no longer being pushed by the next thought or pulled by the last one. You're rooted, not in ideas, but in presence. And that presence has no beginning, no end, no need. It simply holds everything softly, without effort. And now that this stillness has opened inside you, not as a technique, but as a natural state, you're ready to look at the way even morality can become another form of control. Because even goodness, when clung to, can become a burden. And in the next step, we explore what it means to let go of being good, not to become careless, but to discover a deeper, freer compassion that no longer depends on performance. When you begin to rest in the stillness between thoughts, when that quiet space becomes not just a meditation experience, but a way of living, everything starts to soften. You're no longer rushing from one idea to the next. You're not reacting from old patterns or chasing a sense of becoming. You're simply here, alert and calm in the gaps. But even in that stillness, something subtle can arise. A quiet craving, often disguised as sincerity. The need to be good, to be kind, to always say the right thing, to never make mistakes. It feels like humility, but it's often another layer of control, another identity dressed in virtue. And if you're not careful, the idea of being good can become the newest mask your ego wears. Buddhism teaches morality, but it does not teach perfectionism. It encourages compassion, non-harming, and integrity, not as rules to perform, but as natural expressions of wisdom. When morality is practiced from presence, it is fluid, nuanced, alive. But when it becomes rigid, it creates suffering. It forms an identity that is afraid of making the wrong move, afraid of being judged, afraid of not living up to a standard that was never yours to begin with. The pressure to be a good person can become just as binding as any other craving. It shows up as guilt after small mistakes, as fear of conflict, as over-apologizing, over-giving, over-correcting. It becomes a kind of spiritual anxiety, always trying to be liked, approved of, seen as kind, wise, thoughtful. But this need to perform goodness has nothing to do with real compassion. Real compassion doesn't need validation. It acts when needed, rests when needed, and allows truth to be spoken even when it's uncomfortable. Buddhist practice asks you to look beneath behavior and into intention. Not just what you do, but why you're doing it. Are you being kind because it arises from love, or because you're afraid of being seen as unkind? Are you staying quiet out of wisdom or out of fear of upsetting someone's opinion of you? Are you giving your time because it feels true, or because you don't know how to say no without guilt? These questions reveal where morality becomes a cage. Letting go of being good does not mean becoming selfish. It means becoming real. It means seeing how your desire to be seen as good is often rooted in fear. Fear of disconnection, rejection, judgment. And when you no longer need to be seen in a certain light, your actions become more honest, more grounded. You stop playing roles and start responding from awareness. Sometimes the kindest act is saying no. Sometimes truth is more helpful than politeness. Sometimes silence is more powerful than pleasing words. Buddhism encourages ethical living, but not as performance. It's based on clear seeing. When you truly understand suffering, you naturally want to reduce it. Not because you're supposed to, but because you've felt it. You've sat with your own pain. And from that depth, kindness arises, not as a strategy, but as a movement of the heart. There's no scoreboard, no reputation to manage, just presence meeting life. When you let go of the pressure to be morally perfect, you make space for genuine transformation. You allow yourself to be human, to make mistakes, to learn from them without self-punishment. You no longer measure your worth by your behavior. You stop needing your goodness to be visible. You trust that integrity doesn't need to be advertised. This kind of morality is quiet. It's not dramatic. It doesn't perform. It acts when necessary and rests when it's time to let go. It doesn't avoid conflict just to keep the peace. It knows that real peace is not always pleasant, and that truth, even when it disrupts the surface, often brings deeper healing than niceness ever could. Perfectionism often confuses discipline with rigidity. It says you must never slip, never get angry, never disappoint. But in practice, discipline means returning, again and again. You will lose your temper. You will say things you regret. You will fail to meet your own standards. And that's not the problem. The suffering comes when you identify with those moments, when you turn them into evidence that you are not enough. But when morality is grounded in awareness, not ego, there's space for imperfection, for repair, for growth without shame. Many people carry deep wounds from early conditioning around goodness. They were praised for being quiet, compliant, helpful. They learned that love was conditional, that being good meant being safe. And as adults, they bring that same pattern into their spiritual lives. They try to be the perfect practitioner, the always compassionate friend, the endlessly patient parent. But underneath is fear, a belief that love depends on behavior. Buddhism helps you untangle this. It shows you that real freedom isn't about being seen as good. It's about seeing clearly, acting from wisdom, not fear. Sometimes letting go of being good means telling the truth when it's hard. It means setting boundaries, walking away, disappointing expectations. It means no longer apologizing for taking up space. This kind of letting go is not rebellion. It's release. Release from the need to be someone you're not. Release from the story that love must be earned through constant self-sacrifice. This also transforms how you see others. When you're no longer obsessed with your own moral image, you stop judging others so harshly. You see their struggles, their contradictions, their growth. You understand that no one is all good or all bad. You stop putting people into categories. You become more patient, less reactive, more curious, less rigid, because you're no longer operating from a narrow definition of worth. This perspective also allows more honesty in relationships. You stop pretending. You speak more directly. You don't hide behind pleasantries or spiritual language. You say what's true without needing it to land a certain way. And this honesty builds real intimacy, not based on roles, but on shared presence. Ethics without ego become fluid, contextual, rooted in the moment. You stop clinging to rules and start listening more deeply. What does this situation require? What does love look like right now? What causes the least harm without betraying yourself? These questions can't be answered from a script. They require presence, sensitivity, courage. Letting go of being good also dissolves self-righteousness. When you no longer build identity around morality, you stop needing to be better than others. You stop using ethics to judge, control, or feel superior. You see that everyone is doing their best from their level of awareness, and that awareness, not behavior, is the real path to liberation. This kind of compassion has nothing to prove. It includes yourself. It forgives the parts of you that still struggle. It allows space for confusion, contradiction, complexity. And in that space, something more honest starts to grow. Not goodness, but sincerity. Not performance, but presence. Not image, but truth. And when truth becomes more important than approval, you're finally free. Free to love without pretending. Free to speak without fear. Free to live without constantly monitoring your impact. You still care, but your care is no longer tight, anxious, or performative. It flows from the same place your breath flows, from presence. And now that the weight of being good has lifted, now that your actions come from awareness instead of ego, something else begins to shift. You start to notice how even love can become heavy when it clings. How compassion, if tangled with control, begins to hurt. And in the next step, we explore the art of loving without attachment, of caring without grasping, of allowing others to be free, even as you offer your deepest presence. When the need to be seen as good finally dissolves, when your actions no longer come from pressure to prove something, but from the quiet clarity of presence, a different kind of space opens in the heart. It's warmer, softer, it breathes without effort. But within that space, just as peace begins to settle, another deeply rooted habit often shows up. The urge to hold tightly to the people you care about. The need to protect, to manage, to keep close what feels meaningful. This doesn't come from malice. It often comes from love. But love, when confused with attachment, turns heavy. Compassion, when tangled with clinging, becomes a source of suffering. And now, this is the next truth Buddhism invites us to explore. That real compassion does not bind. It liberates. The love most people grow up with is transactional, conditioned, or attached to specific outcomes. Love that wants things to go a certain way. Love that fears being lost. Love that tries to shape others into what feels safest. In daily life, this is seen in subtle ways. Wanting someone to behave a certain way so they don't hurt themselves or you. Wanting to be understood so deeply that you become frustrated when you're not. Wanting the people you love to stay close, agree with you, or never change. These are natural desires, but when left unchecked, they begin to suffocate the very love they arise from. Buddhism doesn't ask you to stop loving. It asks you to love more freely. It teaches that the deepest compassion is not controlling, but open, not possessive, but expansive. It sees others not as extensions of the self, but as beings on their own path, with their own timing, their own karma, their own unfolding. And because of that, real compassion holds loosely. It supports without smothering. It helps without needing repayment. It listens without needing to be right. This is where the practice of metta and karuna, loving kindness and compassion, become more than rituals. They become ways of being, but only if they are free from clinging. Clinging makes love conditional. It says, I care about you, but I need you to be this way. I want the best for you, but I also want control. I forgive you, but only if you learn fast enough. Real compassion removes the but. It gives space. It says, I love you, even if you never change. Letting go of clinging doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop trying to mold people into your idea of who they should be. You allow them the dignity of their own experience. You trust that pain can teach just as much as comfort. You support, not by saving, but by showing up, by being present without needing to fix. This kind of compassion is rare because it requires letting go of ego, even the part that feels noble. The ego that says, I know what's best for you. I'll keep you from making mistakes. I'll be the one who never lets you down. But those roles are not compassion. They are masks, and they create pressure, not peace. When you release these masks, love becomes quieter but deeper. You don't need dramatic gestures. You don't need constant affirmation. You simply care, and that care doesn't need to be seen or validated. It's enough that it flows through you. It becomes something you are, not something you do to be good or useful or safe. And when others sense this kind of love, they feel free. They feel accepted, even in their chaos. They don't feel managed, advised, or judged. They feel held, not with hands, but with presence. And that presence is what truly heals, because it creates safety without control, attention without agenda, connection without ownership. It also allows you to stay balanced. When compassion is clinging, the moment someone pulls away or behaves differently than expected, the heart contracts. You start to feel abandoned, betrayed, confused. But when compassion is open, you remain steady. You still feel pain, but you're not destroyed by it. You don't personalize their choices. You don't collapse when they change paths. You understand that love is not about holding people in place. It's about walking beside them while they move. This view of love also teaches healthy boundaries, not the kind built from fear, but from clarity. You can care deeply without sacrificing your own well-being. You can say no without guilt. You can step back without shutting down, because you're not loving from need, you're loving from awareness. Buddhism helps you see that true compassion isn't soft in the way people assume. It can be fierce, clear, even sharp when needed. It doesn't always say yes. It doesn't always agree. But it always comes from presence, from a mind that isn't trying to manipulate the future or protect an image, a mind that simply sees suffering and responds to it, not with strategies, but with sincerity. The practice here is subtle. It's about noticing when your care turns into expectation, when your support turns into pressure, when your giving comes with a quiet need for something in return. Noticing doesn't mean judging. It just means becoming honest. Honest enough to let go. Honest enough to stay with love, even when it no longer looks the way you want it to. This also helps you be more forgiving, not just of others, but of yourself. Because when love is no longer about perfection, you stop punishing yourself for getting it wrong. You learn that presence matters more than performance, that showing up again and again, even imperfectly, is more healing than saying the right thing with a closed heart. And this love, this open compassion, doesn't burn you out, because it doesn't drain you. You're not constantly trying to hold things together. You're not constantly managing people's emotions. You're not constantly protecting your image. You're simply loving, when it's easy, when it's hard, without needing anything in return. This doesn't mean you let people walk over you. It means you respond from clarity. Sometimes you walk away. Sometimes you stay. But either way, your decisions are clean. They're not based on guilt or fear or identity. They come from stillness. And from that stillness, love flows naturally. It touches everything you do, not as a performance, but as an undercurrent. You speak more kindly, not because you're trying to be good, but because harshness feels out of alignment. You give more freely, not because you're performing generosity, but because holding back no longer makes sense. You also become more resilient in heartbreak, because when you don't cling, you can grieve without collapsing. You can mourn without regret. You know that nothing was owed to you, that love is a gift, not a guarantee. And in that understanding, grief becomes sacred, not something to escape, but something to honor. Letting go of clinging in love doesn't make you distant. It makes you real. It allows you to show up fully without pretending. It allows you to receive love without needing to own it. It allows you to lose people without losing yourself. And now that your heart has opened without grasping, now that compassion has become a steady stream instead of a strategy, you're ready to explore the next doorway to freedom. Not through emotion, but through speech. Because even the way you speak can become a form of control. And in the next step, we explore how to release that too. How to speak without grasping. How to let go mid-sentence. How to use your words not to manage outcomes, but to deepen your presence. When love is no longer about control, when compassion flows freely without needing to shape others or preserve your image, your presence becomes softer, more honest. You begin to show up as you are, not as who you think you need to be. But even in that honesty, another layer often hides. It's woven into your words, shaped in tone, carried in pauses. The need to influence, protect, or prove something through speech. It's subtle. You may speak gently with all the right words, but somewhere inside your sentences lives a desire to steer the moment, to direct someone's reaction, to be understood, validated, accepted. This is where speech becomes another form of clinging, and this next step is about seeing through that, letting go, not after the conversation, not days later, but in real time, mid-sentence, as a living practice of non-attachment. Speech is rarely neutral. Most of what is said carries an intention, often hidden even from ourselves. We explain to defend. We talk to be liked. We fill silence to avoid discomfort. We ask questions hoping for answers we've already imagined. We compliment expecting warmth. We apologize so the other will let go. Even small phrases often come with big expectations. And while none of this makes you wrong, it reveals how deeply speech is tied to ego. Not just the words you use, but why you use them. In Buddhist teachings, right speech is one of the fundamental elements of the Eightfold Path. Not because it's about being polite or proper, but because the way you speak shows where your mind is attached. When you speak with control in your voice, there's clinging underneath. When you speak with urgency, there's often fear. When you speak with sugar-coated kindness, there's sometimes a subtle manipulation. The path asks you to listen for these things, not in others, but in yourself. One of the most profound practices is to become aware of your speech, not just after you've spoken, but while the words are forming. Mid-sentence, you notice a tension, a motive. You are about to explain something to avoid being misunderstood, and suddenly you see it's not needed. You let the sentence fade. You smile instead. Or you are telling a story to make a point, and you realize halfway through that you're just seeking praise. So you stop, or you soften. You release the hook, not because silence is better, but because you're no longer using speech to grasp at control. This kind of letting go isn't dramatic. No one else may even notice. But inside, something shifts. Your words begin to serve the moment, not your identity. Your speech becomes cleaner, freer, less entangled. You still speak when needed, but now there's space around your words. They're not holding your self-image together. They're not building a version of you for others to see. They're not trying to get something from the world. They just express what's true, or they don't. And in that gap, where you once pushed, there's peace. Letting go mid-sentence teaches you humility. You learn to leave things unsaid, not because you're hiding, but because not everything needs to be managed. You don't have to correct every misunderstanding. You don't have to defend your choice. You don't have to explain yourself every time you feel uncertain. You begin to feel the pull to speak, and you pause. You feel the rising of a joke meant to make things easier, and you let it go. Not to withhold, but to return to presence. And the most surprising thing happens when you do this. Conversations become more honest. Not because you're saying more, but because you're saying less from ego. There's less performance, less posturing, less commentary. You're not trying to control how you're seen. You're simply responding from the moment. Your presence speaks louder than your words, and your silence begins to hold more truth than any explanation could. This doesn't mean you speak less overall. It means you speak from a different place, from grounded awareness, not from anxious reactivity, from clarity, not performance. Sometimes the most loving thing you can say is, "I don't know." Sometimes the most compassionate thing is silence. Sometimes not finishing the sentence is exactly what the moment needs. This kind of awareness takes practice. It begins by watching your speech after the fact. You notice when you talked too much, when you interrupted, when you exaggerated. You don't judge yourself, you just notice. Then, with time, you begin to catch it as it happens. You feel the contraction in your chest before you defend yourself. You feel the tightness in your throat before you try to impress. And eventually, the gap between urge and action widens. You have space, and in that space, you find freedom. You stop needing to explain away your discomfort. You stop using words to manage other people's emotions. You allow pauses to stay pauses. You let others have their experience, even if it includes misunderstanding or discomfort. You trust that clarity doesn't need to be forced. It arises when both people are ready, and until then, your presence is enough. This practice also shifts your listening, because when you no longer speak to control, you listen without preparing your response. You stop waiting for your turn to speak. You let the other person finish, even if they're wrong about you. You hear more, not just the words, but what's underneath. And this deep listening becomes another form of letting go. You no longer need to be the center. You no longer need to correct every detail. You simply stay open. Letting go mid-sentence is not about withdrawal. It's not about becoming cold or indifferent. It's about trust. Trusting that you are safe without managing every moment. Trusting that you can be misunderstood and still whole. Trusting that your worth does not come from being right or impressive or smooth. It comes from presence. And when your speech no longer comes from the need to control, it becomes a gift. People feel safer with you, not because you always say the right thing, but because they feel no pressure to be anything other than they are. You're not trying to fix them or win them over. You're just present. And that presence is healing. This practice also changes how you speak to yourself. The inner voice becomes softer. The inner dialogue becomes simpler. You no longer need to narrate every moment or justify every choice. You rest more in silence. You begin to enjoy not having to explain, not having to narrate your life to yourself, just being here without a story. And slowly, speech becomes sacred, not because it's rare, but because it's conscious. Each word chosen, not from fear, but from clarity. Each silence honored, not from avoidance, but from wisdom. You begin to taste what it means to speak from stillness, to let go not just after reflection, but in the moment of speaking itself. This is freedom, not dramatic, not loud, but steady, real, and it touches everything. Conversations become less about outcomes and more about connection. You stop needing closure. You stop needing the last word. You stop needing to tie things up perfectly. You trust that truth doesn't always need to be spoken to be known, that love doesn't always need to be explained to be felt. And now, with speech no longer used to protect or project, with silence no longer a sign of weakness, the mind begins to release something even deeper, the need for preference, the way you grasp at choices, at likes and dislikes, the belief that peace comes from getting what you want. And in the next step, you'll meet the radical teaching that true freedom comes not from choosing more, but from needing less, not from having control, but from releasing the illusion that you ever needed it at all. When you stop speaking to control the outcome, when even mid-sentence you're able to release the need to shape perception or manage impressions, what you're left with is space, clear, steady, and undemanding. The silence you once feared begins to feel like home. And as that silence deepens, something becomes undeniably clear. It was never just speech that held tension. It was the constant craving for things to go your way. The unspoken assumption that peace, happiness, and ease only exist when the world matches your taste. This is where the next doorway opens, not into more choice, but into the quiet power of not needing choice at all. Because the root of so much suffering is preference, and the Buddhist path offers a radical alternative: equanimity. Equanimity is not indifference. It's not coldness or apathy. It's not the passive resignation that comes from giving up. It's presence that no longer clings. It's awareness that can hold both joy and pain without being thrown off balance. It's the steady heart that remains open, not because everything is easy, but because it no longer insists that everything should be. Modern life celebrates choice. The more options you have, the more free you're supposed to feel. But for many, more choice creates more anxiety, decision fatigue, regret, comparison. The mind becomes overwhelmed with scenarios, trying to pick the perfect outcome, fearful of missing out or making the wrong move. Buddhism offers a different view. Real freedom isn't found in getting what you want. It's found in not needing what you want. It's found in the ability to meet each moment as it is, without demanding that it be different. This begins with seeing how often your peace depends on preference. You're comfortable when the weather is right, when people agree with you, when your plans go smoothly. But the moment life shifts, too loud, too slow, too uncertain, you tighten, you resist, you blame the moment for not matching your internal script. But that script is optional. It's not reality. It's a habit, a reflex, a quiet belief that only certain conditions are worthy of your peace. Letting go of preference is not the same as having no taste. You can still enjoy things. You can still appreciate beauty, comfort, kindness. But the difference is, you're no longer bound to them. You no longer fall apart when they're absent. You don't withhold your peace until the world cooperates. You move through life with openness, not with conditions. This shift changes everything. Traffic isn't pleasant, but it no longer steals your presence. Delays are inconvenient, but they don't steal your calm. Criticism doesn't feel good, but it doesn't shake your center, because you've stopped believing that life owes you constant agreement. You've stopped measuring reality by how well it fits your taste. This is the heart of equanimity, not the absence of pain, but the absence of resistance. It's when joy doesn't inflate you and sorrow doesn't shatter you. It's when praise doesn't trap you and blame doesn't define you. You stay steady, not because you're detached, but because you're free. This freedom starts small. You notice the minor irritations, the wrong temperature, the wrong seat, the noise, the weight, and instead of tightening, you soften. You breathe. You let go of the urge to fix the moment. You practice being okay, not because the conditions are ideal, but because you've stopped making your okayness dependent on conditions. Equanimity doesn't mean you don't care. It means your caring is deeper, less reactive, less fragile. You can stay present in someone else's pain without drowning in it. You can offer help without demanding an outcome. You can love without needing to possess, because your heart is no longer swinging between clinging and rejecting. It's rooted in something steadier than emotion. It's rooted in awareness. And awareness is naturally equanimous. It doesn't prefer one thought over another. It doesn't cling to one emotion and reject the next. It simply holds what arises without grasping. When you rest in awareness, equanimity begins to unfold, not as a mood, but as a state of being, not something you try to feel, but something you learn to trust. One of the ways to strengthen this trust is through reflection. Look at your history. How many moments were ruined because they didn't meet your expectation? How many relationships suffered because you needed someone to be different? How many days were wasted trying to force the world to match your plan? And how often, once the moment passed, did you see that your resistance caused more suffering than the situation itself? The practice is not to eliminate desire. It's to hold desire lightly, to want without needing, to prefer without demanding, to act without attachment. This is the middle way, not passive, not grasping, just steady. And yes, you will forget. You will tighten again. You will react. But now, instead of collapsing, you return. You return to the breath, to the body, to the awareness that sees without judging. You remember that you don't have to believe your preference, that peace isn't on the other side of a perfect moment. It's available now, in your willingness to stop resisting what is. This kind of peace doesn't shout. It doesn't sparkle. It just settles. It anchors you. It gives you back your energy. Because when you stop spending your attention trying to reshape life, that attention returns to you. You have more clarity, more space, more capacity to respond instead of react. Equanimity also brings clarity to your relationships. You stop trying to control people. You don't need them to validate you, agree with you, or reflect your values. You meet them as they are. You listen more deeply. You speak more honestly. You don't mold yourself to win approval. You don't shrink when they disapprove. You're not passive. You're grounded. This balance extends to your inner life too. You stop fearing your own emotions. You stop chasing the pleasant ones and suppressing the painful ones. You welcome joy without clinging. You meet sadness without resistance. You understand that feelings are weather, real but not permanent, and you learn to watch them come and go without losing your center. Equanimity is the fruit of deep practice. It grows slowly. But every time you pause instead of react, every time you stay instead of escape, you water the roots. You begin to live from a quieter strength, one that doesn't need conditions to be perfect, one that doesn't make peace wait. And from this strength, life opens up, not because it gives you what you want, but because you stop needing it to. The small things don't bother you the way they used to. The big things don't break you the way they could have. You're still human. You still feel. But you're not tossed around by every wave. You float, even when the tide changes. And now, from this steady place, not numb, not indifferent, but quietly alive, you begin to notice another layer of attachment, not just to the present moment, but to the timeline of your life, to when things should happen, to what age you should be when it all makes sense. And in the next step, you begin to free yourself not just from preferences, but from the pressure of time itself. When you stop needing life to match your preferences, when peace no longer depends on outcomes, there's a quiet freedom that begins to take root. You stop clinging to the ideal version of the present, and something opens in its place: spaciousness, clarity, ease. But just as that grip softens around how life should look, another one often tightens around when it should all happen. Not just preference, but schedule, a timeline, a silent measurement ticking in the background, telling you where you're supposed to be by now, what should have already happened, and how long it's taking to get there. This is one of the subtlest, most exhausting forms of attachment. The belief that your life must unfold on time. Time isn't just something you move through. It's something the mind uses to compare, judge, and apply pressure. You look at your age and ask if you're behind. You look at your progress and ask if it's fast enough. You look at others and feel like you're late to your own life. This is where suffering begins, not in what's happening, but in when it's happening, or worse, when it isn't. The mind builds entire identities on timelines: career by this age, relationship by that one, clarity after so many years of practice, enlightenment after a certain number of retreats. You don't just want things, you want them on schedule. And this invisible schedule becomes a source of constant stress. Even when things go well, they rarely feel like enough if they don't arrive on time. This time-based clinging is so normal, it often goes unnoticed. You feel anxious, but don't realize it's tied to a story about when something should have happened. You feel discouraged, but don't question the timeline that's fueling your urgency. Buddhism helps you bring this into the light. It doesn't ask you to stop caring. It asks you to stop measuring. It asks you to see that peace is never late. It doesn't arrive after milestones. It's already here, covered by your expectations. Letting go of the timeline means loosening your grip on the story of becoming. The belief that you're on your way to some final version of yourself. The idea that life has a correct rhythm you're supposed to match. The pressure that says you're not just living, you're falling behind. When this belief dissolves, time softens. It no longer pushes. It no longer judges. It becomes space, not demand. You can still move forward. You can still grow, learn, shift. But the movement is lighter. It's not driven by comparison or panic. It's not filled with the anxiety of being off track. It comes from presence, not pressure, from curiosity, not control. This shift is especially powerful in spiritual practice. Many people carry subtle expectations about how fast they should wake up, how soon they should reach peace, how long it should take to stop reacting. They use the language of growth to measure themselves, and in doing so, they create new suffering. But awakening doesn't follow a clock. Presence is not on a timer. You don't get closer to truth by rushing toward it. You get closer by stopping the rush. Some progress happens quickly. Some takes decades. Some unfolds in silence without visible change. Some arrives all at once after years of apparent stillness. There's no formula, no checklist. And any attempt to measure spiritual progress by timeline will only take you further from the freedom you're seeking. This truth also applies to healing. Emotional wounds don't care about your calendar. Sometimes you feel fine for months, then fall into old pain without warning. Sometimes the very thing you thought was healed returns. Not because you failed, but because healing isn't linear. It spirals, it deepens, it revisits. Letting go of the timeline means letting the process move at its own speed, in its own way. You also start to see how much of your suffering in relationships comes from this same attachment. You think love should arrive at a certain point. Commitment should follow a schedule. Understanding should happen on cue. But people are not clocks. They don't change just because time has passed. They grow when conditions are right, when awareness is present, when pain is fully seen, when patterns are met with compassion, not pressure. Letting go of the timeline in love means trusting that connection is not about deadlines. It means allowing space for timing to be organic, not giving up, but giving room, not forcing movement, but honoring pace. And sometimes it means accepting that you and someone else are not moving together anymore, not out of failure, but out of respect for reality. This also transforms how you view aging. The timeline says aging is decline, that youth is peak and everything after is loss. But Buddhism sees aging as ripening, not deterioration, but unfolding. Each year is not a countdown, it's a deepening, a peeling away, a refinement of what truly matters. When the timeline collapses, so does your fear of getting older, because there's nothing you're late for, there's nothing you've missed, there's only now. You also become less obsessed with goals, not because goals are wrong, but because the pressure around them fades. You don't need to achieve something by a certain date to feel whole. You can still work hard, still build, still create. But the work is free from the anxiety of time. You're not running, you're not proving. You're just doing what the moment asks for, without dragging your worth into the result. And now, the question becomes, what are you without your timeline? If you're not late, not behind, not rushing, then what's left? Presence, breath, awareness. This moment, right here, not as a bridge to something better, but as life itself, not as a means to progress, but as the destination already arrived. This doesn't mean you abandon structure. You still show up. You still meet deadlines, keep promises, plan wisely. But none of it defines you. You're not trapped in it. You're not waiting for the future to rescue you from the discomfort of now. You've stopped using time to delay your peace. This is the collapse, not of time as a concept, but of time as a weapon against yourself. When you stop measuring, stop comparing, stop rushing, you start to see clearly. And what you see is this: peace is not later. Healing is not waiting. Awakening is not a distant peak. Everything you were hoping would come in time is already here, in the space that opens when you stop demanding that life move faster. From here, you begin to walk with ease, not because everything is easy, but because you're no longer dragging the weight of when. You meet people without needing them to be on your schedule. You meet your emotions without checking how long they've lasted. You meet your practice without wondering how close you are to the goal. You're not in a hurry because you've realized there is nowhere else to be but here. And now, from this timeless awareness, with the schedule dropped and the striving dissolved, a new kind of letting go is possible. Not just of milestones, but of closure itself. Because sometimes things don't resolve. Sometimes stories don't end cleanly. And in the next step, you'll learn what it means to let go without understanding, to release the past without needing it to make sense, and to find peace in the space where no answers come. When the grip of time falls away, when the pressure to arrive, achieve, and align with an imagined schedule dissolves, you're left with something rare: peace without conditions. You stop asking how long something will take, You stop needing your life to reach milestones to feel valid. You stop running. And in that stillness, something else reveals itself. A quieter, deeper kind of discomfort. The kind that doesn't come from delay, but from lack of closure. The wound that hasn't been explained. The relationship that ended without answers. The apology that never came. The moment that left a question behind and never circled back. Letting go of time is one thing. Letting go without understanding is another. But this is where Buddhist practice deepens. It teaches not just how to be present, but how to let go of what will never make sense. Closure is often mistaken for healing. You want the story to end neatly, to wrap itself in logic, to deliver clarity. You want to know why they left, why it happened that way, why the pain had to come. You want to be able to label it and file it away so you can move forward cleanly. But life rarely gives you that gift. Some doors never close. Some conversations never happen. Some people vanish without explanation. Some pain remains unanswered. And Buddhism offers a radical invitation in those moments, not to fix it, not to finalize it, but to let it be unfinished. The mind wants resolution. It believes peace can only come once the loop is closed. So it replays the moment. It analyzes the silence. It tries to build a story that makes the ending feel complete. This searching becomes its own form of suffering, not because clarity is wrong, but because needing it becomes another chain. The truth is, some things don't resolve because they were never supposed to. Not because you did something wrong, but because not all stories fit into language. Some lessons arrive without words. Some growth comes from silence. Letting go without closure begins with recognizing that understanding is not required for healing. The absence of answers does not block peace. It only blocks the ego's version of peace. Real peace comes from being willing to live with the question, to stop waiting for someone to explain, validate, or confirm your experience, to hold space for confusion without demanding clarity. This is not resignation. It's maturity. It's the willingness to stop asking life to complete your narratives. There is beauty in the unresolved, but only when you stop trying to control it. You don't need to know why it ended. You don't need to know what they were thinking. You don't need to have the final word. You don't even need to understand your own emotions fully. The practice is presence, not perfection. You breathe into the ache. You sit with the unknown. And slowly, the need to label, to resolve, to close, it fades. Not because you've answered the question, but because the question no longer defines you. This also means you stop chasing justice in the way the ego wants it. You stop needing the scales to balance perfectly. You stop needing someone to suffer for the harm they caused. Not because justice doesn't matter, but because clinging to it steals your freedom. Buddhism doesn't deny pain. It doesn't pretend injustice is fair, but it shows you how to free yourself from needing the past to fix itself. You reclaim your energy from the courtroom in your head. You stop waiting for the verdict. You start living now. No closure means some pain stays open, but open pain can still be held with compassion. You don't need to close the wound to care for it. You don't need to understand the cause to soften around the feeling. Presence becomes your response, not solutions, not conclusions, just presence. That's enough. And slowly, the pain changes, not because it's explained, but because it's seen. Seen without needing to resolve it. Seen without needing to turn it into a lesson or a victory or a chapter in your hero story. Just felt, met, allowed. That's how healing begins, not by closing the loop, but by stepping out of the loop entirely. This shift also brings clarity to memory. You stop rewriting the past to make it easier to hold. You stop editing your story to fit a better narrative. You allow the mess. You allow the confusion. You allow the contradictions. You stop needing everything to mean something, not because meaning is useless, but because peace doesn't depend on it. This also transforms how you treat others. You stop pressing people for closure. You stop demanding explanations they may not be ready or able to give. You stop chasing resolution in conversations that aren't ripe. You learn to end things gracefully, even when they feel incomplete. You stop needing everyone to agree on the story. You let others have their truth. You stop making peace dependent on shared perspective. This is a sacred maturity, the kind that allows grief without conclusion, that allows love without return, that allows endings without clean bows. You become someone who doesn't need everything to line up, someone who can walk away without bitterness, someone who can leave the door open, not because you're waiting, but because you're no longer afraid of open doors. And then, something surprising happens. The energy you once spent searching for closure returns to you. You feel lighter, not because the pain is gone, but because the grip around the pain is gone. You carry the wound gently now. You're not pressing on it to extract a lesson. You're not showcasing it. You're just holding it. And that holding becomes part of your wholeness. You realize that closure was never the requirement. Openness was. The willingness to remain open even when the story didn't finish, even when the words didn't come, even when the apology wasn't offered. You didn't get what you wanted, but you found something better: space. This kind of spaciousness becomes a gift to others too. You stop needing to wrap everything up in conversations. You allow others to speak clumsily, to disappear, to say the wrong thing. You don't need every moment to resolve. You just let it move. And when someone asks for closure you can't give, you meet them with honesty, not performance. No closure also means letting go of the belief that closure would have changed everything, that the right words would have healed you, that the right ending would have made it all okay. But maybe it wouldn't have. Maybe the deeper healing was never in the ending. It was in the letting go of needing one. And so your story remains open, not broken, not unfinished, just open. And that openness becomes sacred. It becomes the place where life still moves, where peace still enters, where presence still grows. You realize that what you thought was incomplete was actually alive, that the ending you never got was making space for something else to begin. Now you move forward, not because the past is resolved, but because you've stopped trying to resolve it. You've stopped using your energy to finish something that doesn't need to be finished. You've learned to stand in the middle of mystery and call it home. And from that mystery, you begin to feel the depth of emotion without drowning in it. You stop running from feeling. You stop needing it to go away or make sense. And in the next step, you meet that emotion not with analysis, but with stillness. You learn to sit in its presence, to watch it rise and fall, and to finally understand what it means to feel everything without clinging to anything. You've just traveled through some of the deepest teachings Buddhism has to offer, not as abstract philosophy, but as a real, living path to freedom. You've met the silence beneath your thoughts, questioned the identity you've clung to, released the exhausting need to be right, let go of the future, the past, and even the timeline of your own growth. You've stepped away from the craving to be seen as good, loved without holding tight, spoken without needing control, and discovered that peace has nothing to do with outcomes, and everything to do with your willingness to let go. This wasn't about learning more, it was about carrying less, less of the story, less of the weight, less of the illusion that your peace lives somewhere else. Because it doesn't. It's here, in the breath, in the space, in the letting go. And now, if even a single part of you feels a little lighter, a little clearer, or a little more open than when you began, leave a comment below and write, "I'm learning to let go." It means you're not just listening, you're walking the path. If you found something valuable tonight, something that helped you breathe more deeply or see more clearly, then subscribe to the channel. New teachings like this drop regularly, and each one is a step further into stillness, freedom, and presence. Hit that bell icon so you don't miss what's next. Until then, stay soft, stay aware, and most of all, keep letting go.